Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is the first in a brand new series from the wonderful mind of Wayne Harbison. As ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag TeamFEAR. This is the first follow-on from the Thirst, which was specifically written for my entry into Evil Idol, but unfortunately, as you know, I didn't make it through to the next round, so I hope you do enjoy. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Shadows on a Tin Star, A Tale of the Witchkin. Part 1. Let's get straight into that. Desiree saw out her last caller from Miss Amanda's Gentleman Club and locked up the door for the night. She rather enjoyed her life here in Lunam. It was far better than back in Paris, where she provided the same services as she does here for a pittance in comparison, and a heavy dose of scorn thrown in. It seemed that these reduce as sèche American men appreciated French women, and she definitely appreciated them. As she pulled her shawl around her against the night air and headed down the short path leading to the house out back that her sisters shared, she couldn't help but smile to herself at the thought of the small store of money she'd managed to cash. With a little more time, she'd have enough to move to San Francisco and retire. As she worked her way down the winding path, she found herself humming a bawdy tune that one of her customers had taught her between other exertions. Desiree realized that she was becoming very much a bon vivant, and she liked the idea. Reaching a turn in the path, she looked up to see a figure standing in the moonlight alongside the well-worn dusty trail. "Hello," she called in her heavily accented English. "Are you lost?" "Oui, mon cher chaton," the figure said. "I am trying to find the path back to town." His accent was strange, but for some reason welcome. Desiree was surprised to hear her mother's favourite pet name, and surely his use of the name was simply a coincidence. She smiled and said, "If you will simply go back the way I came, it will bring you to town." "Merci beaucoup," he answered, with a slight but elegant nod of his head, and stepped out onto the path just as a cloud passed from in front of the moon, bathing him in its soft silver glow. As the soft grey light played on his dark clothes and pale skin, she could not help but notice his eyes had a strange red fire about them. She could not tell much about how he dressed. It was a dark suit of some sort. His eyes, though, she couldn't take her gaze from his eyes to look closer. They seemed to pull her into the red fires and made her burn as if she'd been gazing too long into a blaze. The last thing she remembered was those eyes before she felt a slight pain in her throat, and then a pleasure rushed through her body like no man had ever made her feel. And then, like the darkness of a cloud over the moon, the shadow fell over her life and she saw nothing else. Marshal Ophir McKnight sat on the wagon that had once belonged to the unfortunate Vorderbergs and looked down into the valley that contained Lunam, Nevada. The town was just a few miles northwest of the Incline Village and ran right up to the California state line. It was big enough to have several streets and was dominated by one huge Georgian-style mansion sitting on the hill on the other side of the valley. Below it ran several streets making up a good-sized city that served the silver miners and loggers alike. At the far south end of the valley stood a single two-story brick home with huge front windows that cast back the blue of the August sky. Taking off his hat, he wiped his head with the handkerchief he kept in his pocket. He clucked once to his horse and began the long winding climb down that had once been a game trail to the valley below. 20 minutes later, he was riding through the August dust on the main street. He smiled as his mind catalogued what he was seeing. He was identifying areas from where attacks could originate, bolt holes to retreat into, and the best way to gain the high ground. He noted that there were 2 saloons on this street and a building at the end that he quickly identified as a brothel, a high-end one at that. There was a bank, a dry goods store, a livery stable, and what looked like a boarding house, a barber, and a blacksmith and farrier shop. And although the two saloons appeared to have rooms for rent above them, the town boasted an actual hotel as well. That told him that the rooms above the saloons were probably not used for just sleeping. It was better to stay in the hotel. And passing a small cemetery, he saw a tall, lanky figure standing at the foot of a fresh grave. And from the cast of his shoulders, the figure seemed to be still in the early stages of mourning, and probably still wrestling with the grief. Fear understood. The darkest days of his life were when he had buried his mother and sister in a single month. Not long afterward, his father had disappeared from the face of the earth to fulfill a promise he made to Fear's uncle Theodore. A promise that need not have to be fulfilled. Thoughts of the past pulled up unwanted emotions, and he heard himself growl. And from somewhere deep in his soul, he let the beast begin to stir. Best to put those memories to the back of his mind. He still had work to do, and all the clues pointed towards Lunam. He stopped at the livery stable next to the aforementioned blacksmith and farrier. The sign above it read, Western Horses and Accoutrements, Wheeler Weston, Proprietor. At the sound of the wagon, a man came out of the barn section of the building that led to the back corral. He was short, squat man with huge arms, a head full of brown hair, and an infectious smile. "Morning, stranger," he said. "Morning," Fear replied. "I'm looking to stable my horses and these other two until I can dispose of them." "Dispose of them?" the man asked. Fear twisted in the saddle where the man could see the U.S. Marshal badge on his vest. "I found a family about a day's ride back. Looks like they'd been attacked. All 6 were dead. I buried them and brought their wagon and horses here to turn over to the local sheriff to decide what happens to them." The old man took off his hat. "Family got a name?" Fear reached behind him and picked up the family Bible. "Name in the front is Vordenberg." Taking a deep breath, the man held up his hand and said, "Just give that to Jed Taylor. He's the acting sheriff until we can elect a new one." "What happened to the old one?" Fear asked. "Fell off his horse in the middle of the night. His son found him outside their barn the next morning. Damned this thing too. Guy Plant was one of the finest horsemen that ever sat saddle." And there was a tone in his voice that suggested that he didn't entirely believe that tale. "Well, the hunter is mine," Fear said. "The others go with the wagon. If you'll see to their care, I'll appreciate it." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out $2 silver. He felt them tingle against his skin, a reaction he had inherited from his mother. Handing them to the proprietor, he asked, "How long would that get me for my horse?" 40 cents a day, or $2 a week, the man said. Then looking up at Fear, he asked, "I didn't get your name. Marshall?" "McKnight," Fear told him. "Fear McKnight. Yours?" The man smiled and thumbed in the direction of the sign. "Whalen Weston." "The sign says Wheeler." "Wheeler was my brother. He died last year when a ornery mule kicked him in the head. I run both the shops now." He pointed to the blacksmith and farrier shop. "I'm sorry for your loss," Fear told him. "You a bit young to be carrying one of them things?" Whalen nodded at Fear's saddle. "What things?" "Confederate sword." Fear smiled and said, "It was my father's. I sometimes find it useful in my line of work." Climbing down from the wagon, he pulled a saddlebag from his horse and asked, "Which way to the sheriff's office?" "Just down the street, next to the bank," the man said. "One last question," Fear said. "Where can a body get a room with a clean bed and a good meal?" "I take it you're not looking for entertainment, then?" Fear shook his head with a smile. "You take it right. Go to the Morgan Hotel. Can't miss it. There's a big sign hanging out front. It's run by a young couple who don't put up with no shenanigans." "Good to hear," Fear replied, tipping his hat. "Appreciate the information." "You're rightfully welcome, Marshal. Tell the Morgans I sent you." "Will do," Fear said, pulling his rifle and sword from the saddle and heading down the street towards the wooden walkway. The streets might be dry, but he would rather keep his boots out of the kind of thing horses tended to leave in the middle of them. He passed the bank and entered the sheriff's office. Behind the desk, a lanky man in his late 20s or early 30s, with a head full of straw-coloured hair, and was trying to fill out some paperwork. The man looked up and asked, "Can I help you?" and then noting the badge on Ophir's chest, he said, "Oh, what can I do for you, Marshal?" Ophir sat the Bible on the table and said, "Family of 6 was attacked and murdered back about half a day's ride. Their wagons, supplies and horses are at the livery stable. I buried them by the creek." The man stood, came around the desk and offered his hand. "Jed Taylor." Ophir smiled at the man's earnestness. He shook his hand and said with a smile, "Ophir McKnight." "Ah, you're that marshal that went across the deadline in Oklahoma and drugged that Cavendish fella out. They say you never fired a shot." Ophir nodded and said, "The world's a better place with men like Caesar Cavendish facing a rope. He liked to hack women and children into little pieces with a machete. Killed 18 people that way. Judge Parker wanted him to face trial, and so I made sure he did." "I ain't arguing with you there," Sheriff Taylor told him. "What do you want me to do about the family? I mean, if you've already buried them and brought their stuff in." "Was anyone in town expecting them?" Ophir asked. Jed shook his head. "Not that I know of. I can ask around. Is there a name in that Bible?" Ophir nodded. "Vordenberg." "I can't say I've ever heard the name, but I'll ask around." "I appreciate it. How long are you going to be in town for, Marshal?" "At least a week," Ophir told him. "There are some things I want to check out." "About who attacked the Vordenbergs? I didn't think marshals actually did any investigating." Ophir smiled. "Normally we don't, but I had to bury a family of 6, and 2 of which were just little children. That kind of monster doesn't need to be walking around. I'm looking for a specific type of killer." "You got a name?" "Not yet," he said. "I figured I'd stick my whiskers into a few things and see what comes up." He paused and then added, "The man at the livery said that the old sheriff died from falling off a horse?" "Yeah, I can't figure that. Guy Plant was one of the best horsemen I've ever known. Hell, he was better than any Indian I've ever heard of. The idea of him falling off his horse just doesn't make any kind of sense." Ophir simply nodded. He knew that the sheriff hadn't fallen off any horse. The man had been attacked and transformed into the thing he'd killed last night. That, however, wasn't the kind of thing he was about to tell this deputy sheriff. "Did the sheriff have any family?" "Just his son, Daniel. Good kid. Not sure what he's going to do now." "How old? 15 or 16? Not quite a man yet, but not a boy either." "Tall, lanky, blonde-headed?" "Yeah. How do you know?" "I saw him at the cemetery coming into town." "Where's he staying now?" Ophir asked. "Right now he's staying with the Blevins. Jubal Blevins owns a local bank, and he and the Sheriff Plant were close friends." "I know what it's like to lose your pa," Ophir said, his mind drifting back to those last days after his mother had been killed and his twin sister neutralized. He remembered watching helplessly as his father sank deeper and deeper into depression and madness. In a final stroke of irony, he took himself out of this world while at the same time fulfilling his promise to always keep Bon Travail safe. And then, shaking the weariness out of his mind, he turned back to Taylor and asked, "Outside of Plant, has there been anything else unusual happening in town?" "Doc Meacham up and left town a few days ago. He settled up his bill at the livery stable, loaded his gig, and the last we heard, he'd taken to the train to San Francisco. Anybody new in town?" "Some fella from Hungary bought the old Shipton house that sits up on a hill overlooking the town. He hasn't shown up yet, but he's put a lot of people to work fixing up the old place. He even turned around one of the old rowdier ne'er-do-wells by giving him a job." "Who's in charge of that?" Ophir asked. "Wyman Dickerson. He's a lawyer. He's got an office 1 street over." Ophir started to reply when 2 boys burst into the office. One was the boy he'd seen earlier in the cemetery. The other was somewhat shorter and with a bit thicker frame and a mass of a chestnut hair and eyes that were so grey that they bordered on being white. "Sheriff, Mr. Morgan sent us over. Something has happened to one of Miss Amanda's girls." "Wait a minute, Kelsey. Slow down. What do you mean something's happened?" "I don't know. They wouldn't tell us. They just said to come get you." "Who said to come and get me?" "Miss Amanda and Chester Pegg," the taller boy said more calmly. "From what I've heard them talking, it was Miss Desiree. The sheriff reached for his hat and gun belt. "Well, come on, boys. You can stay here while I'm away." He looked over at Fear and said, "You can come along. Never hurts to have another set of eyes and ears." Fear nodded and held the door for the other three. Clearing the walkway, the two boys tore off down the street in the direction of the large 2-story building that stood at the intersection of the next street about 50 yards away. Fear noticed that the taller boy was moving at quite a clip, more out of habit than any real interest. Fear stared at the boy with his other sight, and what he saw brought him to a dead stop on the walk. Both boys were fairly blazing with whatever energy it was that surrounded Witchkin. "What is it?" Sheriff Taylor asked. "Nothing," Fear said, trying to cover his surprise. "Just the sun in my eyes." He adjusted his hat and continued down the walkway with the sheriff, choosing not to have to dodge unpleasantness in the street. "Who was that other boy?" he asked after a few seconds. "Kelsey Blevins. He and Dan and Temple Seward have been friends. I guess, well, forever. They're all about the same age and their families all came to Lunam at the same time. I know Jubal Blevins, Sheriff Plant and Arthur Seward have some history before coming here." Fear nodded and smiled at the man's talkativeness. He found that he liked this young sheriff who'd, evidently, had the job thrust upon him. "Arthur Seward?" Taylor indicated behind them with his thumb. "He owns the big ranch sitting at the edge of town near the lake. Comes from England. I heard some people say that his brother is a doctor over there who runs some kind of hospital." Fear raised an eyebrow and then asked, "Then Temple is his son?" Taylor laughed and said, "No, Temple is his daughter, and about the only person that can keep up with them two boys. She has a raven-haired little beauty the same age. They all three grew up together. She rides like a lady, shoots like an army scout, and takes no lip off either them boys. We all figure someday those two are going to realize that she's a girl, and then there's going to be a hell of a row between them." Fear just smiled as they stepped off the walkway to cross an alley and then picked up the new walkway. The buildings this far down were just a little smaller, maybe a little shabbier, but they weren't yet an unpleasant section of the town, being as there was a saloon on one side, along with a barber and gunsmith. He noted that there were fewer women moving about. On the building at the intersection that faced the street, he could see a sign that read, "Gentlemen's Social Club." "Social club?" he asked with some amusement. The married women folk of the town get upset when we call it a whorehouse," Taylor replied with a smile. "This maintains an illusion of respectability and keeps them from having to push it for it to be torn down and Miss Amanda run out of town. After all, she pays for the good half of the town's school expenses, and that's a pretty penny. She runs a quiet and admirable, if not respectable, house." Fear nodded. He'd come across quite a few towns in the west where there was an accommodation reached between the respectable part of town and those who supplied an outlet for more bawdy impulses. It usually didn't last long. Usually about the time the third or fourth church went up, there started to be problems. Mainly it keeps the rowdies coming down every 2 weeks from the logging camps and silver mines from harassing the respectable ladies. That would explain a lot, Fear told him. Crossing the street at the corner, Fear spied a crowd of men standing around the alley. Dan and Kelsey were at the back of the crowd jumping up and down, trying to see over the heads of the taller men. And after a few moments, Kelsey looked at the other boy and nodded to the left, saying something that was lost in the sounds of the street. The other boy nodded, and they tore off into that direction. "Bet they're going to circle around to the next alley," Taylor said as he reached the back of the crowd. And then he said loudly, Okay, let us through. Come on. Isaac, get out the way." Both lawmen started to shoulder their way through the press of men until they reached the back of the building where a woman was standing, looking worried. She was in her mid-30s with a head full of red hair and dressed in a pretty yellow dress that showed off more of her figure than would normally be acceptable. "Okay, what's happened, Miss Amanda?" Taylor asked, suddenly all business. "It's Desiree," the woman said, grief apparent in her voice. "Where is she?" "Down the trail, Jed. I left some men to watch over her. We didn't touch anything," a portly man with a silver hair said. "Well, at least there's that," Taylor told him. "Marshal McKnight, this is Jubal Blevins. Jubal, this is Marshal McKnight." Ophir shook the man's preferred hand. The same, Marshal, who brought Caesar Cavendish in to stand trial? Blevins asked. And for just a second, Ophir could feel a slight surge of power through the hand. This man had been touched by witcheries in some way. Ophir nodded and said, "It's good to meet you, Mr. Blevins. Now, which way is this young woman's body?" He pointed down the trail that led from behind the building through a copse of trees. "Down there, about 30 yards or so." "Follow me," Taylor said. Then turning back, he told the other man, "Jubal, see what you can do about getting these people to go home." "Will do," the older man replied. "And I'll send Kelsey and Dan back this way. I think they're trying to take a shortcut." "Thanks," Jubal called. "They didn't come home last night." Ophir followed the other men down a well-worn path into the copse of trees. "Where does this trail lead?" he asked. To a house Miss Amanda owns. All the girls live there. Miss Amanda doesn't want them living where they work. She says the familiarity breeds contempt." "Guess that makes sense in a twisted sort of way," Ophir said as they rounded a bend to find two men standing over the body of a young woman. She was lying face down in the dust, and her head was at an unnatural angle. Looking over the tree line, he spotted the two boys hiding in the shadows, not saying a word. Their faces seemed quite surprised. Ophir nudged Taylor and then pointed towards them with his head. "Kelsey, you and Dan need to head back out of here. Jubal's looking for you." The boys turned and looked at each other. Finally, Dan shrugged and turned around and headed back. Kelsey followed him wordlessly. "Eerie the way those two seem to communicate without words. It's the same way with Temple," Taylor remarked casually as he looked down at the body. Ophir looked at the men who'd been standing watch. "Has anyone else been down this way?" "No, Marshal," one answered. He bent down and breathed deep. Along with the death scent underlying the woman's perfume, there was definitely the same stench of the grave he'd found at the Vordenberg's campsite. "Do you mind if I roll her over?" he asked Taylor. "Go ahead." Gently turning the body over, Ophir noticed the two deep puncture wounds on her throat. Behind him, Taylor inhaled deeply. "Looks like a snake bite." Ophir nodded. Knowing that this was not a snake bite, he cast his gaze along the path and saw several boot prints. Among them were the expensive men's boots like the ones he'd seen yesterday. Now he was sure that the threat was here in Lunham. It was just going to take some good old-fashioned investigating to find the one responsible and put an end to him. Ophir looked back at the body and noted the broken neck and realized that she would not rise from the dead tonight. The thing that had killed her had seen to that. For some reason, he was choosing those he infected and discarding the ones he only meant to feed on, and that suggested a plan. "You said the doctor left town?" Taylor nodded. "Yeah. Waylon Weston said something really spooked him." I can imagine." "You have some idea about this?" Taylor asked. Ophir shook his head and said, "I'm not sure. It looks like the same kind of attack that killed the family." "You think we got something roaming these mountains, killing folks?" "Sheriff Taylor, there's always something roaming these mountains killing folks. Most of the time it's just an everyday animal of some kind, or a rogue Indian. But I think this was something more specific." "What?" "That's just it. I'm not sure. I haven't gotten it all figured out yet." He stopped and looked back up the trail. "How many people live in Lunham?" "About 900 or so." "And the nearest town?" "Incline Village. It's at the foot of the railway." "Population there?" 4,000, give or take 100 or so." "Why?" "Just wondering," Ophir answered. "Is there any place we can take her?" "I guess down to the house. Miss Amanda can make the arrangements for her." He looked down at the body and said, "If you'll give me a hand." 12 years ago, in Budapest, Arthur Seward and two of his closest friends and fellow members of the Lucid Via had been plumbing the depths of things that man was not meant to know when they'd come across a remarkable find, and in a peak of rashness that the only young men in the prime of their lives can experience, had done something very brave and very foolish. 4 people had paid with their lives for the actions of the 3. He could sense on the wind that more were to come. As he sat down in his study with a copy of the Examiner he picked up in town yesterday, there was a knock at the door. Looking up, he saw Jin Chow bowing slightly in the smart Chinese surcoat he always wore when on duty. "Mr. Blevins is here to see you, sir," he said in a faint accent that Arthur knew the man would always carry. "Zexi, Jin Chao. Please send him in," Arthur told him, noting the smile the man always wore when he spoke to him in his native language. Jin Chao nodded and backed out of the door. A few moments later, a rather worried-looking Jubal Blevins entered the room. When Jin Chao backed out yet again, Jubal turned and locked the door. The years had been good to Jubal. He barely showed his 40-plus years, and his thick head of shining gold hair had turned to a silvery grey. But the body was a healthy Anglo-Saxon stock. He complained of an occasional ache or pain, usually a trick knee that he'd injured in Europe that he passed off as a form of fictional Indian attack. But for the most part, he was very fit for a man his age. "Please tell me that Kelsey and Dan stayed here for the night." "And they did," Arthur said, getting up and watching his old friend carefully. "They slept in the guest rooms. We all had to talk about a few things that were bothering them." "What things?" Jubal asked worriedly. "Mostly outsiders trying to stick their noses where they don't belong. My name got dragged into it, so I'm going to have to deal with it in my own way." "That sounds ominous," Jubal said. "Not as ominous as it could have been." Then, taking a closer look at his friend, he asked, "What's the matter, Jubal? You look like you've seen a ghost." "From almost any other men, I consider that an offhanded remark. But I know you better, and I know you know me." He shook his head, swallowed, and said, "No, I haven't seen a ghost, but something nearly as bad." "What?" Arthur asked. "There's been another death in town," Jubal said. "Who? How?" "One of Miss Amanda's girls, Desiree," he replied. "What? Did some lugger get out of hand or something? Surely Jed Taylor can handle it," Arthur asked him, watching his friend carefully. "Her neck was broken, Arthur," Jubal said, the worry apparent in his hazel eyes. "Sheriff's looking into it now, but I'm not sure that he's going to find anything that will make sense to him. And there's a U.S. Marshal helping him." "Marshals don't investigate crimes. They bring in the wanted," Arthur told him. "Perhaps you are worrying more than you should." Arthur was not sure if he was trying to convince himself or his friend. "What's got you spooked?" "It's Marshal McKnight, the man who walked into a saloon in Oklahoma Territory, thrashed a dozen desperate men, and dragged Caesar Cavendish out by the hair of his head." "Okay, he's competent," Arthur conceded. "I got a good look at him today, Arthur. He's more than competent." "What?" "I looked at him with my other sight. He's a Witchkin." "Are you sure?" "Outside of the children, I've only ever seen one aura that strong before, and I'm not sure you know what we're talking about." Arthur suppressed a shudder at the thought of the still-haired count from whom they had stolen treasure more valuable than gold. "What do you suggest we do?" "I'm not sure we should wait to find out if there's a third murder. I'm thinking of sending Mariah to Virginia City or San Francisco for a while." Arthur shook his head. "She'll never leave with what has happened, especially since Kelsey and Daniel spent the night here and nobody's family last night." Jubal nodded and said softly, "I'm not so sure that he didn't spend the night with his family." "The children aren't related by blood," Arthur told him. "We don't know that for sure," Jubal said. "And they're Witchkin. We don't know what kind of connection they have." "Friends," Arthur said confidently. "More than that, not yet. If Temple is forced to choose, it may tear them apart," Jubal said. "Perhaps," Arthur said carefully. Information about the Witchkin, particularly the clan these three were from, was scattered and rare. He managed to piece together some things, though, and part of it suggested that the kind of bond that was forming between them was the very thing that the darker breed of the race feared the most. Something called a corpus tre, a body of three. His research suggested that it was the very reason that other breeds had hunted them to near extinction. With a smile he said, "Perhaps she won't." "Won't what?" "I'll have to choose," Arthur said. Jubal raised an eyebrow and asked, "You realize what you are suggesting, don't you?" "Your own daughter?" Arthur shrugged and replied, "And your son, and Guy's son." Arthur gestured to the 4 chairs by the window where Just last night he had sat with the children, and they smoothed over some ruffled feathers as it was. "Please sit down, Jabal." He then took the chair opposite him and asked, "You don't believe the story about Guy falling off his horse either, do you?" Not for a minute," Jabal told him. "Guy could shoot, fight, eat or sleep from horseback, and not slow down. You know that. He carried all three." Jabal looked around as if to make sure he couldn't be overheard. "All three of the children through that pass at a full gallop, with those gypsies shooting at us the whole way." Arthur nodded solemnly at the memories of more than a decade ago. 7 brave men, all members of the loose set via, had set out to snatch a treasure far greater than the silver in a Comstock load from under the noses of some of the most powerful Witchkin known. Of the good 7 friends that had begun that fight, only 3 of them made it back to London alive. The image of the young Guy Plant riding full tilt through a mountain pass, one hand on the reins and the other wrapped around 3 very frightened children as a clan of gypsies bore down on them, rose before his mind's eye. Jabal and Arthur had ridden behind him as coursers, protecting the flanks of him and the children they'd stolen. The 4 others made a last stand against the forces of darkness. All of that death so that they could get a very special trio of children out of the hands of a very evil Transylvanian nobleman who no longer stood on his side of death. "What do you suggest we do?" Jabal shrugged and said, "I'm not sure. Ophir McKnight introduces a wild card into the mix that we can't predict. He's Witchkin, but as far as I know, he operates on the side of the angels." "You think he'll be helping in finding the cause of this?" Jabal shook his head and said, "I don't know. And we both know who, or at least what, the cause of this is. I saw the girl's throat. We both seen marks like that before." Arthur nodded his head and said, "Vampires. My thoughts as well. We need to keep the children out of this, but we need to know that if one gets involved, it'd be nearly impossible to keep the other 2 from becoming embroiled as well. And if Daniel gets the idea that this has something to do with Guy's death, then it could get very ugly very fast." "I know, Jabal, I know," he said. "And I fear that when that occurs, it will set into motion events that will rapidly spiral out of control." "Maybe we should send them all away," Jabal said. "San Francisco is nice this time of year." Arthur shook his head and said, "No, they wouldn't go. Trying to send any of them away right now would likely result in more difficulties than it would solve." "What do you mean?" Jabal asked. "It would seem that Parson Holloway has taken it upon himself to suggest that Daniel shouldn't be spending so much time around Temple, and that perhaps Daniel is, as a lawman's son, isn't fit to be seen with my daughter and your son. I'm afraid it's going to backfire." Scratching his eyes out was the least threatening thing Temple said she was going to do to him. "So what do we do?" Jabal asked. "If these deaths are somehow connected to the Witchkin, then how do we keep them out of the fight?" "We don't," Arthur said. "When we set out on this experiment, it was to try and recruit some Witchkin we could trust into society. Maybe it's time to graduate them." Jabal sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know about you, Arthur, but somewhere along the way, Kelsey stopped being an experiment and became my son. I think Guy felt the same way. I'm worried about sending him to fight the same kinds of monsters we fought in Hungary." Arthur nodded. He understood how his old friend felt. It echoed in his own feelings. But this was a fight for the life and freedom of the common man, to keep the dark forces of the netherworld from controlling this one. "I understand, Jabal. Probably more than you do. A father's relationship with his daughter is different than that with his son. There are 1,000 instincts in me screaming out to send her away, to protect her." He paused for a moment before he said, "And God help me, some of that is to protect her from Daniel and Kelsey. Neither of those boys would ever hurt her, Arthur. They cut off their right arm before doing that." "That's not what I mean, Jabal," he replied. "You know what I mean. I am doing my level best to look at the situation as being part of who and they are, and them not being quite human, not quite mortal. But being her father keeps getting in the way of that." Jabal nodded and said, "I know what you mean. What should we do then?" "We wait," We watch, and we try to guide them. Abel Morder got off his horse and tied it up in front of the silver shaft. He had been up in the logging camps working to keep the loggers fed with something other than stale beans and crumbly bread. It paid decently, and he'd managed to bring in a couple of good-sized bucks. The camp let him keep the skins to sell as he chose. He'd heard some disturbing rumours about his brother though, and they'd brought him down to check them out. The idea of Cain working an honest job was so surprising to him that he had to come find out for himself. And there was a crew about to get paid at the end of the week, and so he decided to come in a little early to avoid the crowd and rowdiness that always brought. He wanted information, not a fight. Tying his horse, an old hunter that he really should have sold years ago, but he found that he liked the animal's company more than most men and could not stand the thought of him being worked to death behind a plough. He dusted off his old clothes and headed through the bat-wing doors. The Silver Shaft wasn't the best saloon in town, but it at least was one where a man could get a beer at a reasonable price without it being watered down. It was a place where a lot of other things could be had out back without it costing a man an arm and a leg. All he had to worry about was getting rolled, and Abel Morder was too smart for that. He sidled up to the bar and nodded to Ben Marston, the barkeep, and said, "Beer." Looking to the man on the other side, he added, "And refill theirs too." Ben gave him a nod and went to pull 3 more glasses, saying, "You in town a bit early, ain't you, Abel?" Abel grunted and said, "I thought I'd come and check up on my little brother." Ben nodded and replied, "He's not in here right now. Don't expect to see him till sometime after dark. He keeps new hours now." "I heard that," Abel said. "Heard he got himself a job, working for some kind of dandy back from east." Ben shook his head. "I don't know anything about him being a dandy. Really ain't met the man. Don't even know if he's in town. Last I heard, he hired some fellas from Floreston on the other side of the mountain to go up and fix up the old Shipton place. Done a right fine job too, from what I heard. Cain ain't a carpenter. What's he doing up there?" "Foreman, from what I hear," Ben said. "Makes good money from it too." Abel shook his head. That didn't sound like his brother. Cain would never work when he could loaf and never had more than 2 bits last him a week. "Quite a few changes around here since last time you were in town, Abel," another voice said. Turning around, Abel saw Wally Ayers, the owner of the Silver Shaft, leaning against one of the tables. "Such as?" Wally shrugged and said, "Sheriff Plant died, went and fell off his horse. Jed Taylor's the sheriff now, and Doc Meacham's left town." "What happened to Doc Meacham?" Abel asked. He always liked the short silver-haired old man who had a penchant for wearing black. Wally shrugged again and said, "Nobody's sure. He just up and left early one morning. Ain't been back since. Most people are wondering where Kelsey Blevins and Daniel Plant are going to lock horns, though," Jarrett Majors said from the bar as Ben handed him the round that Abel just bought. "Thanks, by the way." Abel squinted at Majors and asked, "Those two are closer than a couple of bear cubs, huh? What makes you think they're going to tussle?" "Oh, she's about their age, with black hair and blue eyes. Both of them spent the last night up at Seward's place," Major said. "So?" he asked. "They've been doing that since they were kids." "Well, it's no secret that they both were sniffing after Temple Seward since they figured out that the thing between their legs is for something other than just pissing." "That's enough," Ben said from the bar. "We don't talk about respectable womenfolk in saloons round here, Jarrett." "Respectable?" Jarrett asked. "Half the town is convinced that girl is a witch. Nobody's saying anything about it, but everybody in this room knows that strange fires and winds keep cropping up every time that girl gets mad." Abel stood up and turned to Majors. "Ben told you to shut up about Miss Temple. Now I'm telling you to shut up too. She's a respectable girl, and we don't talk about respectable girls in saloons." Majors held up his hands and backed up. Okay, I didn't mean nothing by it." "Keep that in mind," Abel told him, turning back around and saying, "Besides, there ain't no such thing as witches." Wally smiled at him and said, "I guess you could ride up to the Shipton place, or I guess it's the Drake's place now. But we all still think of it as belonging to the Shiptons. I'm sure Cain's probably up there making sure the carpenters get their work done before sundown." Abel nodded his head and said, I might do that. Or you could wait until he comes in some time after sundown, Ben said from the bar. He usually does. Abel noted the look that flashed across Wally's face, and Wally was wanting Abel to go up there for some reason. Something told Abel he wouldn't like it if he did. Maybe. I still need to get a room. Hadn't had a bath in over 2 weeks or slept in a real bed neither. Well, Verge has the barbershop open until 7, so you can get a bath and shave there, Wally said. I thought he just kept a chair at the Black Dog, Abel asked him. He decided to open up his own place, making a pretty good money too. Abel grinned broadly and said, Well then, I'd like to see a man make good money. Think I'll mosey down there and get a bath and shave, and then find a room. Wally grinned and said, That you can get here or at the Black Dog. Abel shook his head and said, No offence, Wally, but your beds aren't used for just sleeping. I got myself no desire to sleep in another man's game. Wally just grinned. He knew the score. No need. I know what my rooms are used for. I make more money from my rooms in a day than Sam Pegg makes in a week from his. Abel just smiled and said, And you still got the best beer for the best price in town. Appreciate that, Abel. I really do, Wally said as Abel finished his beer and headed out. The trip down to the barber was quiet. The miners weren't due off shift for several hours, and the loggers hadn't been released from the camps yet, so most of the folks he'd met in town were just common folks making a living as best they knew how. Abel Mordor had no illusions about how folks saw him. He was a man out of place, and 50 years ago he would have been a trapper or mountain man living as far away from normal society as he could. But the wilderness was shrinking, and it was harder to get away from people. The only real wilderness left was up in Alaska and Canada, and he had no desire to spend his winters freezing his bits and pieces off. And so he spent his time as a hunter working for various logging companies, supplying them with occasional deer or elk for a modest return. It let him wander as he saw fit, and most people left him alone. Lots of folks would be surprised that he agreed to Arthur Stewart about the logging though. Too much land was being stripped, more than anybody really needed, and most of it was disappearing down the silver mine shafts. It left a lot of the mountains surrounding the town looking like they'd been scalped, and when the land was scalped the game went somewhere else. And that was one of the reasons he'd come to Miss Temple's defence so quickly. Seward might be a rich and powerful man, but he respected the land, and Abel couldn't fault him for that. And he'd been right. It was bad form to talk about respectable girls in a saloon. That kind of thing could get a man shot. He tied up the old hunter at the hitching post of the barber and went inside and hung his hat on the wall. Looking over, he saw that Verge had someone in the chair and was meticulously shaving him. Looking up, he said, I'll be with you in a few minutes. And with this, his back to Abel. All he could see was a mop of blonde hair. No hurry, Verge, he replied. I'm in town for a while. Just wanting a shave and a bath. Hello, Abel, Verge said. Well, you can get a bath first, or wait for more water to heat up and get it after your shave. Abel smiled and sat down in one of the waiting chairs and said, I'll wait. Never did like to shave after getting in a bath. Always made my throat itch for hours. That's 'cause you don't shave enough when you're out in the woods. Your throat gets tender, Verge told him. It was an old argument between them, the best kind, because each man was right, but the argument was fun. Who am I going to shave for, Verge? The squirrel don't care, and neither do the deer or elk. It's your throat, Verge told him. So it is, Abel said. Working his way around the other customers, Verge worked with a quick and sure hand. Verge was one of the few men Abel would let near his throat with a straight razor, and that included himself. As the chair rotated on its swivel, the other customers came into clear view. Jed Taylor smiled and said, Hello, Abel. Been a while. Jed? Abel replied with a smile. Heard you were sheriff now. Yeah. I wish I was still deputy, though. Gonna be hard to get used to this place without Sheriff Plant. You gotta have your hands full tonight when the mining and logging camps let out. Well, luckily we got a marshal, U.S. Marshal in town. He's willing to give me a hand. Says he just came up from the Oklahoma Territory. Name's Ophir McKnight. Abel shook his head and replied, Rough place down there. I hear just about every low-down skunk west of the Big Easy are hiding out in that place. Jed didn't quite nod. That would have been stupid with a blade at his throat, but instead frowned slightly before saying, "That about sums up the place. They think they can disappear into there and just kill any lawman that comes in after them. I heard that the marshal went in and got Caesar Cavendish. That must have been something. Yeah, that was McKnight. And Cavendish was a mean one, no doubt," Jed said. "I heard he took a machete to a whole family in North Texas, and some folks named Morris." Jed frowned again and said, "Only the youngest boy survived. He went to live with relatives down near Abilene. Ain't no place in the world for men like that," Abel told him. "On that we can definitely agree, Abel," Jed said as Verge finished up with the shave and pulled off the covering to reveal the badge pinned to the former deputy's shirt under his black leather vest. Jed paid Verge, picked up his hat and nodded to Abel, saying, "It's good to see you again, Abel," and then without another word he headed out of the door. "He seems kind of standoffish now, don't he?" Verge simply nodded his head and said, "He's got a lot on his mind, I reckon. One of Miss Amanda's girls was found dead this morning. They're saying a broken neck. Accident or something else?" Abel asked. Verge shrugged and said, "Nobody knows for sure yet. With Doc Meacham gone, there's not anybody to really take a look." Abel nodded as he got into the chair and said, "Heard Kelsey Blevins and Daniel Plant spent the night up at Seward's place last night." "I wouldn't know," Verge said. "Saw them and Miss Temple head up that way a couple of hours before sundown. Never saw them come back, but I don't sit on my porch watching other people and what they do." Abel smiled to himself. That told him far more than anything else Verge might have said, and when the biggest gossip in town refused to say something, it usually meant he suspected something. "See my brother lately?" Verge grinned and said, "Comes in twice a week for a shave." As the barber began stroking the razor against the leather hitch to the chair, Abel said, "Good to hear he's finally getting himself straightened out." Verge put down the razor and lathered up the soap, saying, "Wouldn't go that far, but he has settled down quite a bit since you were last in town." "It'll be good to see him later then," Abel said as the man set about shaving him, all the time chattering like a chipmunk with a new acorn. Marshal McKnight entered the hotel lobby, his saddlebag over his shoulder and carrying both his Winchester and the saber that Waylon Weston had commented on. A pretty golden-haired woman turned around to look at him. "Yes, sir?" "I need a room, clean sheets, and a good meal, Miss Morgan," the woman said. "Gwendolyn Morgan, and we can supply you with all three." "How much?" $1 a night, or $5 a week. That includes the sideboard in the saloon. We do have a restaurant on site, as well as opportunities for gambling. Our faro table is quite popular, and there's also a stage show in the saloon." "Thank you," he replied, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a $5 coin. "This should cover the week." He handed her the money and then asked, "Now, where can I get a bath?" He signed the register. "I can have the bathtub brought to your room and filled, Marshal." She stopped and looked at the register. "McKnight." "Thank you. How long?" "Half hour. It'll be hot." She handed him a key. "Room 208. "Thanks," he told her, taking a key. Then, as an afterthought, he stopped and said, "Oh, I almost forgot. Waylon Weston recommended your establishment." "I'll have to remember to thank him," she replied as she turned again and headed up the stairs. It would be good to get the dirt and dust from the trail off him, and the smell of death from his clothes. Ophir didn't particularly care for most forms of human habitation. Houses were okay, especially large and airy homes like Bon Travail had been while he was growing up. However, as an adult, he had been forced to take accommodations where he could find them. What he discovered was that, to his enhanced senses, most of them were too loud, too bright, and usually reeked of the worst aspects of human habitation. He particularly despised saloons. He didn't have a problem with the activities in the saloon. It was just the odours that lingered he found to be stomach-turning. To him, people stank to high heaven, and he could track most men by smell better than a bloodhound. Even the everyday odours that wafted from an average farmer gave him pause about getting too close. But saloons were the worst for Ophir. A mixture of stale sweat, old vomit, and thick tobacco smoke left him feeling more than just a little green about the gills, and irritable as a bear with a sore paw. When TeamFEAR McKnight was irritated, he tended to break things like people. Word quickly got out that Marshall McKnight had come into the saloon to find a man. The least of their problems was going to be broken bones. He quickly pulled a neatly folded change of clothes from the saddlebags and laid them out. Then, looking at his reflection in the mirror above a small wash basin, he ran his hand along his jawline. From his father, he inherited an almost complete lack of beard, and so his well-tanned face was smooth, only slightly marked by many hours in the sun. Nodding, he tossed his hat on the rack, and took off his gun belt and laid around the cannonball footboard of the bed, and stood his father's sabre in the corner along with a Henry he carried. Both guns used 44 rounds, so it was a bit easier to keep them supplied with ammunition. He sat on the bed and removed his boots. They were perfectly serviceable Wellingtons, a gift from his uncle a few years ago. Removing his woolen socks, he discovered a new hole in the toe and frowned. It probably wouldn't hurt to stop by the dry goods store and pick up a few things. He then kicked off the other boot and sock, and then lay back on the bed and closed his eyes. He couldn't get out of his mind the image of that mother's body burning in the sunlight as it writhed on the ground, trying to reach the safety of the shadows. The sound of her hissing and then her screams as he drove a stake through her heart, and the finality of the thunk when he took off her head echoed through the halls of his mind. And then there was the memory of the smell as their bodies consumed by the cleansing of fire he poured his witcheries into. He would never forget the acrid odour. And slowly he began the mental exercises his grandmother Beaumère had taught him. Finding his center, he slowly cleared his mind of the images, of the smells and the sounds. He was nearly in a relaxed state when a soft knock came from the door. It opened, and the head of a young Oriental man peeked inside. "We're here for your bath, sir." His English was good, if heavily accented. "Thank you," he told him, rising from the bed. The man turned and spoke his own language to someone in the outer hall before striding across the room to close the curtains around the bay windows. He was followed by 4 men carrying a long bathtub made of ash that had been polished to a high sheen. This was a luxury he had not expected. And with a practiced precision, the men quickly got the tub set up and then began to haul steaming water into the room to fill the tub. It took only about 5 minutes for them to fill the tub and quietly exit. TeamFEAR looked at the steam rising from the soapy surface of the water and smiled to himself. He was going to enjoy this. Quickly, he locked the door, stripped, and eased his stiff muscles into the water. He lingered longer than he meant to in the tub, but exited it feeling much better than he had when he rode into town. He dried his tall, lanky frame and put on fresh clothes before strapping on his gun belt and heading downstairs to the restaurant. After eating his fill, he paid and returned to his room to sleep. It had been a long and emotionally draining day. He found the beast in him desirous of rest, and something told him that tonight would be the last chance for a good night's sleep before things turned south. Throughout the centuries, he had been known by many names and titles: hostage, prince, voivode, warlord, liberator, impaler, and the son of the dragon. But today, in this century, in this place that was unknown to the civilized world when he walked the other side of death, he was known as Robert Drake. And on this evening, Robert Drake rose from his box of raw earth to walk the night. For over a decade, his agents had searched out for the thieves who stole blood more precious to him than all the gold in his homeland's mountains. They had finally found not only the thieves, but the vessels that contained the blood as well. They had been rewarded for their hard labour, and now he would punish those who would steal from his godhood. He would take back the vessels, and he would drink his fill of them before ascending. The thieves would pay, and so would those who gave them succour. The vessels were to be preserved at all costs until he had them, and they were the last of their kind, and very dangerous, but he would have them again. And then they would join the ranks of his army of the night. The blood slave, Cain Mordor, had done well with keeping the prying eyes of strangers away, while the workers had hired carried out the work for the final ceremony. Things were moving at a pace, and he was well pleased. Soon the house would be prepared, and he would seize the vessels, drain them, and he would reign supreme among all the Witchkin as their new and forever Witch King. There was only one fly in the ointment, and that was the final fate of one of the thieves, Guy Plant. He had caught unawares the man who'd stolen away the vessels in the middle of the night, and in a peak of insight and lightning strike, he'd turned a knight of the Via Lucente into a rook for the army of the night. Something had taken his new rook, a new piece was on the board, and he meant to find it and take it as his own. As the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains to the west, he paused in the fortified root cellar of the old house and listened. In the distance, he could hear the retreating sounds of the carpenters and workmen he'd hired as they travelled down the Californian side of the mountain to head to their homes in Floriston. The only heartbeat left in a hulk of a house above his head was that of Kane Mordor. He sent out a call into the night and unlocked the reinforced wooden doors. Moments later, Kane entered the root cellar. "You wanted me, Mr. Drake." His voice was rough, and Drake could sense deep in his mind that part of him still riled against the charms and chains that the blood bond had put upon him. Only with much greater expenditure of his will could Drake drag the man's lips to the word master. In his own way, Drake even admired that, before now, he had need of the man. "Something new has entered the town below. Go, discover what has become of Sheriff Plant, and report back to me." "What else?" the man asked. Drake understood that the man was asking if he should bring someone else to the house tonight so that he might feed. "No, I will find my subsistence tonight," Drake said. "Perhaps it is time I repaid Solicitor Dickerson for his gift of this house." "Yes," the man said and backed up the stairs, never taking his eyes from Drake's. Drake smiled at him and released just a small minute of his power into the man's mind. Mordor's slow retreat suddenly became a scramble up the wide wooden stairs, and when the sound of Mordor's boots were long gone in the night, Drake left the root cellar, locked its doors, and began a slow walk to town below. He could feel the thirst grow inside of him. It was time to satiate it and to put the next phase of his plan into action. Also, it was time he sent a message. It was a good thing that his thirst was building. It would be satiated and more this evening. Gwendolyn Morgan closed the ledger. The hotel was doing quite well, and if they continued in this vein, they should be able to expand even further. She smiled at the thought of the nest egg she and her husband had begun to build. One of the great things about the New West was that it could hide a multitude of sins if used correctly, and Gwen and Berylyn had a multitude of sins to hide. As far as everyone in Lunam was concerned, she and Berylyn were a young couple who had migrated out west to build a substantial inheritance into something even larger. It was even mostly true, and she could not help what other people assumed about she and Berylyn. Picking up the lamp on the desk, she exited the basement office and headed down the long hallway that led to the back stairs that the staff used to access the rooms. She passed the door that led to the storage shed out back, and out of habit checked it. Finding it unlocked, she took her key from its chain and locked it back, making a mental note to speak with the cleaning staff about it. As she began to climb the stairs, the clamour of the hustle and bustle of the evening began to intrude upon her thoughts. She smiled as she recognized the sounds of the loggers and miners that had just hit the town. Tonight would be a good night. She could feel it in her bones. She opened the door to the main lobby and was hit with a cacophony of her guests enjoying the bounty of their establishment. Looking into the casino, she could see the crowds of men surrounding all 4 of the faro tables. The roulette table was packed, and 2 out of 3 of the poker tables had groups of miners and loggers trying their luck. The third was still trying to fill its seats. Looking closely, she realized that she had at least 2 very distinguished guests at the table, and one was no less a parsonage than Bat Masterson himself. The other was the most famous of the 3 brothers and a cousin who'd been adventuring from Texas to Iowa. Those 2 men would be more than enough to scare off any real competition, and she suspected that it would settle down to a game of 2. The saloon was cracking, and the men inside it were drinking heavily and buying the girls drinks. Of course, the barkeep was serving the girls tepid tea, apple cider, and sometimes just water. If those girls wanted to earn their keep, they couldn't afford to get drunk. A piano player in the corner was pinking out popular tunes from back east. and the restaurant was quiet and filled with more respectable men and women of the town of Lunham. There was seldom issues in there that involved anything more serious than an overcooked steak. Glancing over at the gun cupboard, she noted that it was nearly full. Few men were allowed to enter the casino or the saloon while armed, and it was courtesy she had extended to Marshal McKnight. One never knew when the motel might need his services, for one reason or another. "Looks like you're going to be having a good weekend, Mrs. Morgan," Waylon Weston said from the door to the saloon. "It does," she told him with a smile. "By the way, thank you for recommending us to Marshal McKnight. Just trying to give the man what he asked for. He said he wanted a place to sleep without entertainment." He looked into the saloon and then back to her. "You girls don't disturb the other guests." "Thanks again," she told him. "Any word from Sheriff Taylor about what killed Desiree?" The man shook his head. "No, not yet. I know he and the marshal are looking into it together. And from what Bob Kelly said, it looked like she'd been snake bit in the neck." "How would he know?" "Jubal Blevins left him and Joe Reed to watch the body until the sheriff got there. He heard Jed Taylor say she looked like she'd been bit by a snake." "Hopefully that's all it is," she told him. And then with a smile she added, "Enjoy yourself." "Thanks, Mrs. Morgan," he said, as she nodded and moved to check on things with the kitchen staff. Seeing that Berrien was in charge there and everything was under control, she found herself very pleased with how things were going tonight. The hotel was operating like a well-oiled machine, and she was satisfied. Coming out of the kitchen, she turned down a hall that led back to the stairs used by the staff. Again, she found the door not only unlocked, but standing partially open. Stepping outside into the darkened night, a movement to her left caught her eye. "Hello?" she called. The shadows became still. Shrugging, she turned to go in when a cold hand rested on her shoulder. She jumped and spun around, ready to scream. She'd never seen before the man standing before her. He was tall, thin, an elderly man who, with a neatly trimmed goatee and moustache of steel grey. He was dressed entirely in black, save for a single ruby-red pin on his jacket. His forehead was high, and the massive grey hair on his head was neatly combed back and held in place by a clasp of some sort. His lips were thin and cruel, and very sharp wolf-like canines protruded from the upper line. But what caught her attention the most were the eyes. They were red and seared into her like hot coals. She could feel her own eyes begin to burn from the heat. Gwen made to cry out when a cold hand clamped down on her mouth like a steel vice. She fought against an impossible strength as he stepped closer and closer, pulling him to her. And within seconds, she felt a sharp pain in her neck. Following it was pleasure like she'd never felt before. A pleasure of the soul, of the flesh, and of the mind. In her mind, she began to drift down a long dark shaft of shadows, sliding beneath the earth. The fire in her veins began to dim the further she sank into the shadows until the flames were frozen. An icy chill wrapped itself around her body as the shadows began to devour her soul and her mind. She tried to scream out, but the sound that escaped her was a final moan as the breath left her lungs and death took her. Mariah Blevins had married her husband, Jubal, knowing that the man had a small son by another marriage. Over the years, as it became more and more clear that she was unable to have children of her own, Kelsey became as much her son as he was Jubal's. And over those same years, Guy Plant's son, Daniel, and Arthur Seward's daughter joined Kelsey to occupy a place in her heart. As many times she found herself playing the role of mother to them as well. She never understood why either man never remarried, but some selfish part of her heart was glad they had not, for then some other woman would take her place in Dan's and Temple's hearts. Life in a western town as the wife of a wealthy banker was not unpleasant, and it had the advantage of not having the same kind of cutthroat social scene as she'd left in Chicago. Here, and right now, her biggest concern was keeping Kelsey and Temple from eviscerating Parson Holloway. Only the other day they had, and then she, had learned of the conversation Holloway had with Daniel about the appropriateness of his situation with Temple and Kelsey. The poor boy had nearly taken it to heart and had confessed that he had entertained ideas of leaving Lunham at the parson's suggestion. Only the fact that Kelsey had caught him packing and saved them from more heartbreak. The most ludicrous part of the conversation was Holloway suggesting that it was Arthur Seward's idea. She knew that Jubal and Mr. Seward were going to sit the man down and have a long talk with him about a short subject. But for now, she worried. Kelsey and Dan had spent last night at Seward's residence, which was not an unusual occurrence, but she always worried when her chicks were out of place. They returned home this afternoon with a tale of what had happened to poor Desiree Noir. A very strict instructions from her husband. Everyone was to be indoors by sundown, and to admit no one to the house after that. And sometimes Jabal didn't understand that there were just some things that she could not miss. One of those things was to help those less fortunate as her Eastern Star meeting. There was much to be discussed and planned for, and she could not miss it. After all, she was the worthy matron. But she wasn't completely unheedful of her husband's worries, and so she took with her the small banker's special hammerless pistol he'd bought her and taught her to use. And the meeting had been contentious. The death of one of Miss Amanda's girls had brought out some of the nastiest sides of the local churches. Mariah may not personally care for the woman that Miss Amanda managed at the gentleman's club, but she recognized that they served a valuable purpose in town. They concentrated the rowdier population as well as the miners and loggers who worked in the mountains to a small area of the town that made it easier for the sheriff to manage, and that meant that they would not be harassing the other womenfolk of the town. And that was part of the problem as well. With Guy Plant gone, there were quite a few that wondered if Jed Taylor was up to the job of keeping order in the town. The fact that he had enlisted the aid of a US Marshal for the weekend had soothed a lot of the worries, but not all. There was a very vocal minority that thought it was time that Miss Amanda be shut down and found residence in another town. Mariah was there to remind them that they should do that, and it would be necessary for someone else to pick up the expenses for the local school, expenses that were not insubstantial, and a school that she noted was very good. All of these thoughts filled her mind as she shuffled along the wooden walkway of 2nd Street. Up ahead, beyond the alley, was the last blocks of the stores before the walk turned back and passed into the light blazing from the windows in the Morgan Hotel. She stepped off the walk to pass in front of the alley when the shadow suddenly lurched out towards her, and powerful hands muffled her cries of protest as she was dragged into the shadows. Mariah's last thoughts were that she should have paid heed to Jabal's warning. Wyman Dickerson was just settling into Mr. Twain's novel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and smiled at the thought of the mischief Mr. Twain had caused a little more than 2 decades ago when he derailed a fundraising auction by the Ladies' Aid Society to aid in a national sanitation project. Mr. Twain, then using his real name to write as a reporter for a local paper during the war between the states, had written that the money raised by the auction of the sack of flour was to be sent to the Miscegenation Society back east. It was an outrageous lie, of course, but it irrevocably damaged the travelling auction that was trying to do some genuine good. The end result was that the good Mr. Clemens' sister-in-law was elected from the Ladies' Aid Society, and he himself received no less than 4 challenges to duels. Mr. Clemens left town soon afterwards. Opening the novel to the place he had left off the night before, he slowly lost himself in the outrageous adventures Mr. Twain had imagined for his hero. Huck had just been kidnapped by Pap when a knocking at the door pulled him from the banks of the Mississippi back to his dull and dreary life in Lunam. Putting the novel down, he glanced at his pocket watch. It was well past midnight. Who would be calling now? Hurry into the door, concerned that there may be some sort of emergency. He quickly answered to find a tall, distinguished-looking stranger, dressed in all black, standing at his threshold. Mr. Wyman? Yes? I am Robert Drake, and you were kind enough to make a gift to me of the old Shipton house. His voice was cultured and smooth with a slight European accent. Please come inside, sir, Wyman said, stepping back from the door. I'm afraid you've caught me unawares. I was reading. Drake smiled and entered the home. I apologize for interrupting your relaxation. I will only require a few moments of your time, and then you can return to an eternity of reading if you so wish. What an odd thing to say, Wyman thought to himself as he closed the door. Turning around, Drake rushed him, and in a flash of inhuman speed, Wyman was pinned to the wall next to the door. He tried to struggle against the inhuman strength that held him in place, and the man began biting at his neck. And then came the sharp penetration of the fangs into his flesh, his blood, and then his soul. Wyman Dickerson had all of eternity to read Mark Twain. That night, a plague began to spread throughout the confines of Lunam, Nevada. Death had come to town on leather wings and shadow. Shadows on a Tin Star. A tale of the Witchkin. Let's get straight into that. Deadeye stared out at the tree line that ringed the town of Lunam on three sides. They watched the comings and goings of the people there, anticipating a feast that awaited them when their master called to them. A painful and cold thirst gnawed at their beings, a thirst that could only be slaked by the hot blood of the living. The master had chosen well with these men. The silver mines to the east of the town were a natural place for him to hunt. It was enclosed, dark and dangerous work, and the loss of a man here and there would be hidden by the changing shifts. In a matter of days he had managed to build a small company of vampires who would feed upon the other miners and thus build an company of the undead that would then infiltrate the town and begin conquering it, a few citizens at a time. Over the last few days they'd spread out to small farmsteads outside of town, taking 2 or 3 a night, and swelling their ranks. Now more than 20 strong, they were set to blend in with the loggers who had just been released from the mountain above the town. They would sweep into the town among the rowdy workmen, and the town was awaiting them with open arms to spend their pay on food, drink, and women. Not far away, Virginia Tinney locked up the 2-room schoolhouse and walked along the well-worn path between the structure and Weston's livery stable, where she kept the buggy and horse she brought with her from the Incline village. A part of her job as the school mom was to ensure that the classroom was ready for the next day of classes, and that included bringing in firewood, water and coals. And even though there were not going to be any classes until Monday, she was glad to get everything prepared before she left to visit her parents over in Incline village. The surge of rowdies that the release of the miners and loggers brought to town always made her nervous for her own safety. Meetings with parents and the school board about the rest of the year had kept her over late, and the mountains had already cast long shadows across the path. The school had been built along a stream that came down from the mountains to make it easier to supply water to the building. The stream also was a major distraction for some of her boys, as it offered opportunities for catching crayfish, turtles, and small sunfish. And the boys weren't above a little hijinks of pushing each other into it. On more than one occasion she threatened to declare the stream off limits, but realized that would be an exercise in futility. And Virginia herself wasn't above occasionally dropping a line into one of the areas where the creek turned back on itself and formed a slower-moving pool, where bream and bass were likely to hide. As she felt a sudden chill, she stepped onto the path and felt the shadows engulf her like the cold water from Lake Tahoe. Wrapping her shawl around her, she picked up her pace, hurrying towards the lights of the livery stable. For a moment, she thought she heard a familiar voice in the shadows. "Miss Tinney!" A voice that sounded like little Laura Woods seemed to echo off through the trees lining the path. She turned around to look behind her and could have sworn that she saw a small form dart halfway across the path and then leap into the tree limbs. "Who's there?" she called into the night, only to be answered by the tittering of a girl's voice. "Laura, is that you?" "I see you," the voice called again. "And you can't see me." She turned back towards the livery stable and broke into a run. She had gone no more than 2 steps when she felt cold hands reach out and grab her waist and hips. She twisted her body sideways to try and break free of the iron grip, only to spin in place to come face to face with Laura's oldest brother, Luke. He was a tall boy for his age and literally towered over her smaller frame. The shadows gave the 14-year-old boy a pasty look, and his eyes seemed to glow red under his brown hair. She felt her own eyes burning as she locked gazes with him, suddenly unable to move. "She's not going anywhere, Laura," the boy said as he reached out and touched her cheek. Virginia trembled under the icy touch. There was a lust in the boy's eyes like she had never seen before. It was far more than a physical lust, but something deep, abiding, and malevolent. He lusted after not only her body, but her blood and her soul as well. "Come, Miss Tinney," he told her. "You know the way I look at you. You can't miss it," the boy said. "Stay with us," he said as he reached for the button of her dress at her throat. His touch turned from ice to flames as he undid the first 2 buttons and then laid back the collar. She felt her body shiver as she fought to regain control of both her mind and her body. She tried to will her arms to push the boy away, to run away, but found her limbs no longer answering her commands as he leaned in closer to her, his breath cold and fetid as he whispered into her ear. "I know you want me to do this." He pulled her close, pressing his cold, hard body against hers, and at her side she felt Laura take her hand and gaze at her wrist. The girl pulled it from her mouth as if to kiss it, and twin stabs of pain lanced through her body as she felt her fear and revulsion suddenly turn to desire. She felt the dark, cold shadows engulf her like the black waters of the lake. As she went under, she felt herself drain away into the cold depths below. Virginia Tinney learned that night that there were far worse things than rowdy miners and loggers. Something deep in Arthur Stewart's gut told him that time was growing short and that the dark Witchkin had found them, had found the children. He knew that he must act swiftly, and that somehow what had happened to Guy and to that poor girl in town was tied up in it. He lifted his head and looked out across the lights of the town in the valley below, his eyes finally coming to rest on the roof of the Shipton place, sitting on the side of the mountain and looking down on the town. It was lit only by the moon's light. Its hulking form menaced the town below. It was as if something there in the house was challenging his own dominion of this town. Something he'd only sensed once before in his life. It was 15 years ago in Hungary, when he'd stolen 3 young children who had been left abandoned at the gates of an old crumbling castle deep in the Carpathian mountains. Something in that house was connected to the children. He knew it, and he had to do something about it. But then he'd been a much younger and brash man, barely out of just being accepted into society, and the actions of his group had almost gotten them expelled. He leaned against the cane he carried and wished that Guy was still among them. He could use his good common sense counsel right now. "Excuse me, Mr. Seward," Jin Chow interrupted his ruminations. "You asked to be informed when Parson Holloway had arrived." Arthur smiled at the young man and said, "So I did." "I have shown him to the parlor, sir," Jin Chow said. "Thank you," Arthur replied. Then in Chinese he asked him, "Does he know why he's been asked to come?" The young man shook his head and replied, "No, sir. I only told him that you wished to speak to him about a matter concerning the Blevins, just as you told me." "Did he try to question you about it?" he asked. Jin Chow smiled and said, "He tried, sir." Arthur knew what that meant. Jin Chow could be as stubborn as a mule when he wanted to be, or when Arthur needed him to be. The alliance between Arthur and Jin Chow's order had been most productive for both of them. "Thank you, Jin Chow. Will there be anything else, sir?" Arthur thought for a moment and then said, "I'm not sure yet. Possibly. Please remain nearby in case the need arises." "Of course, sir," the young man said, bowing and stepping back into the house. Arthur frowned as he headed inside. This was going to be a bit of an unpleasantness that he really wished he had not had to deal with. But it was something that could not go unaddressed. Parson Holloway had injected himself into his mission in a way that disrupted his and his companion's whole plan. And now he had managed to irritate Temple to the point that she was making threats, right as her witcheries were starting to blossom into full bloom. If he continued to irritate her, she could burn down the whole town in a peak of anger, or level it with a windstorm. It would be best if Parson went away for a while. Entering the parlour, he looked at the man who led the Congratulationist church for the last 10 years. He was tall, thin, and severe-looking, dressed in a black suit and with a wide-brimmed black hat. The latter was in both. He was tall, thin, and severe-looking, dressed in a black suit and with a wide-brimmed black hat. The latter was in both hands as he studied an album of prints Arthur had on display. His hooked nose stuck out over thin lips, and his bushy white eyebrows matched the fading cotton of what was left of his hair. He spoke with a nasal inflection that always gave Arthur the impression that he was trying to come off as wise. Instead, it made him seem like a pompous ass. "Los caprichos," Arthur said as he entered. De Goya withdrew the prints at the turn of the century because he feared reprisals from the church, and Holloway turned and nodded. Arthur could see the print that Holloway was studying, The Sleep of Reason. He smiled to himself, thinking, how appropriate. And shaking his head slightly, Holloway said, "Somewhat macabre, if you ask me." And then smiling, he said, "Your Chinaman said that you wanted to discuss something with me about the Blevings." Arthur hid his dislike of the use of the word Chinaman. Too many of the people in the West took the hard-working Chinese for granted. Instead, he let himself smile slightly at the parson's assumptions about the reason he asked him to come by. "Please, sit down, Parson Holloway," he told the man, gesturing towards one of the comfortable leather chairs. "I had a long walk with my daughter last night, as well as Kelsey Blevins and Daniel Plant. Some news came to my attention during the discussion that I'd like for you to help me clear up." "Anything I can do to help, Mr. Seward," Holloway replied, and Arthur smiled and said, Good. He cocked his head slightly to the side and asked, "Did you or some of your congregation discuss with Daniel Plant a few weeks ago concerning the inappropriateness of his friendship with my daughter?" He kept his voice neutral, neither praising nor condemning their actions. Holloway sat up straighter and put his thumbs in the arms of his black vest, and then replied, "I believe that it might have been mentioned to him that perhaps his attention would not be welcomed by you, sir." And Arthur nodded, his face passive. "And exactly who was involved in all of this? I'd like to make sure everyone is properly rewarded for looking out for my daughter." And Holloway smiled and said, "Well, I believe Deacon Green brought it up, rest his soul." And Holloway replied, thinking back, "And I'm sure that my wife mentioned it to her." And he nodded and replied and added, "And of course, I talked with the lad myself just after his pa died." Arthur nodded and asked, "And just what did you tell him?" Holloway shrugged a gesture that made him look like a gaunt bandy rooster. "I mentioned that maybe him being a sheriff's son and your daughter being from one of the richest families in the state, that he might not have anything to offer her." Again, Arthur nodded and said, "You are aware, of course, that Jubal Blevins and I came to Luna with Guy Plant about a dozen or so years ago, aren't you?" Holloway shook his head and said, "As a matter of fact, I wasn't." And Arthur smiled and asked, "Do you know where I met Mr. Blevins and Plant?" "I can't say that I do," the parson replied. Arthur got up and went to a small folio on the bookshelves and took it down. He ran his fingertips along the leather cover gently and opened it to the first page, where the list of candidates for degrees was listed. Across the top was the seal of the school, Universitat Wien, the University of Vienna. He handed a folio to Parsons and said, "Look under the SS and the BS and the PS." And he watched as the parson read down to finally find the name, Guy Daniel Plant. Guy Plant was a man of letters. We met in school in Vienna. He had hoped that Daniel too would have attended there. And Holloway handed him back the folio, looking confused. I don't understand." Arthur nodded and said, "This much is clear, Reverend Holloway." He cocked his head again to the side and sat down across from him and asked, "What made you think that I would consider the son of one of my oldest friends to be unsuitable as a friend for my daughter." "I didn't know," the parson muttered. "You didn't ask, parson. You assumed," Arthur said firmly. "Furthermore, how is it that you feel that it is your place to make these kind of decisions for my daughter or Jubal Blevins' son?" "I was just trying to look out for the girl's best interests, Mr. Seward. There's already talk around town about the closeness between the three of them." And Arthur nodded and replied, "And if their friendship caused me any distress, did you not think that I would have said something? Temple is not the kind of girl who would sneak around about these things." "All I can say is that I'm sorry, Mr. Seward," Holloway replied, and Arthur snorted. "I'm not the one whom you owe the apology. You owe it to my daughter for impugning her honor, and to Daniel for impugning his value. You are supposed to be a shepherd for this community, Reverend, and you have failed at that, and have interfered with not only my plans for my daughter's future, but that of Sheriff Platt's son." He sighed and said, "The children have discovered this situation on their own. They brought it to my attention." "And their reaction?" "I believe scratching your eyes out was the least violent suggestion Temple had for when she makes your next acquaintance," Arthur told him, reaching into his jacket and pulling out an envelope. "Here are 2 tickets to San Francisco, Reverend Holloway, and $500. I suggest you enjoy a long holiday before my daughter finds you. You're on the 11:14 this evening." The Reverend shook his head. "Surely you don't think she'd actually attack me?" "My daughter is a crack shot, parson." "And you'd allow this?" "It's my daughter's honor you've impugned, parson. She might go to trial, but I suspect that she'd eventually get acquitted." Holloway swallowed and looked at the envelope. "I meant no harm." "You might eventually convince Kelsey and Daniel with that, but not my daughter. She is rather vexed with you right now." And Arthur chose the term rather carefully. He wanted Holloway to think long and hard about why some people in town were willing to give his daughter so much leeway. Holloway took the envelope from the table and said, "I will try to stay out of Miss Temple's way until we leave." And looking at the envelope, he said, "Thank you, Mr. Seward." Arthur stood to show him the door and said, "Don't thank me, parson. I'm rather put out with you myself. I'm only doing this because right now I cannot afford to have children distracted by your stupidity. Chin Chow will show you to your buggy. Good day, parson. I trust we won't see you for quite some time." "Of course," the man said, genuinely worrying now. As the man left, Arthur picked up the folio, letting the nostalgia of his younger years cloud his thoughts, and said softly and sadly to himself, "There are only 2 of us left now. I hope we're enough." Cain Mordo meandered through the town, trying to fulfill the command to discover what had become of Sheriff Plant, while his own will resisted obeying. The conflict in his mind was nearly paralyzing, and on more than one occasion left him standing still and quiet as he peered mindlessly into the vault of stars above the town. The conflict in his mind was nearly paralyzing, and on more than one occasion left him standing still and quiet as he peered mindlessly into the vault of stars above the town. It took several calls for an unfamiliar voice to bring him back to his senses. He turned on the boardwalk to see his brother, Abel, standing in front of him and calling his name. "For God's sake, Cain, answer me!" As his mind returned from wherever it had been, he felt a sharp rap to his face and realized that his brother had been slapping him, trying to get his attention. "You ain't gone and stuck your damn nose in that damn Chinaman's opium, have you, Abel?" he asked, reaching up and touching the side of his face. The feel of the day's growth of whiskers was rough against the fingertips as the stinging of his face began to set in. "What's wrong with you, Cain?" he demanded. "You've been standing here in the street just staring up at the sky." And suddenly he felt exhaustion drag his limbs to his side. He sagged where he stood, feeling the entire weight of his body. He'd been wandering for hours, unmoved by the comings and goings of the miners and loggers that had swelled in the town's population. His stomach suddenly growled, and he realized he'd not eaten at all today. He looked at his brother
and said, "Feel so tired." "Yeah, you look like hell. What's eating you?" "Just tired," Kane replied. "Been working hard for the Mr. Drake." Well, there was enough of his own will left for him to keep using the hated word. "Well, let's get some food in you. You can tell me about it over a good dinner." Kane simply nodded and let his brother lead him, neither man speaking until they settled down at a table in the Morgan Hotel. Well, it was expensive, but Abel had just gotten paid and could afford it. As they sat waiting for their food, Abel asked, "What's wrong, Kane?" "Just, feeling tired, I guess. Got me a regular job working up at the Shipton place." "Doing what?" "Mainly keeping the carpenters working and following the instructions that the Mr. Drake left for the work." "Oh, that can't be too tiring," Abel said. "Ain't like you're hauling logs or anything." And Kane nodded and frowned. "I know, just keeping some long hours. Mr. Drake left some very specific ways he wants things done, and sometimes the carpenters don't understand." "What kind of things?" Abel asked. Kane shrugged, yawned, and then said, "Types of joints, nails, and that kind of thing. Carpenters don't understand why they gotta use brass nails instead of iron. That kind of thing." "Brass nails?" Abel asked, surprise evident in his voice. And Kane nodded and said, "Now he wants me to find out what has changed in the town." "Changed?" With a nod, Kane replied, "Yeah, he wants to know what's different." Abel shrugged and told him, "Different? I'm not sure Sheriff Plan is dead. Fell off his horse, they say." "You know about that?" Kane replied. "What's happened to him?" "Happened to him?" Abel demanded. "He's probably worm food by now. That's what's happened to him." Kane nodded his head, realizing that he was straying into areas he'd been warned against talking about. "What else?" "Well, Jed Taylor's acting sheriff. One of Miss Amanda's girls got herself killed last night. Some say a broken neck, others say it was a snake bite. Seems to me that people could tell the difference." "Know about that?" Kane replied, his voice sounding hollow. Abel shrugged and then added, "Well, I heard there was a marshal in town. He found a family that had been attacked and was trying to find out who did it." And something in Kane's mind switched on. He looked up quickly. The part of his mind that was dominated by Drake suddenly took over. "What marshal? Where is he?" "I'm not sure about his name. They say it's the same marshal that dragged Caesar Cavendish out of that saloon down in Oklahoma Territory." "Where is he?" Kane felt Drake's demand through Kane's own mind. "I don't know. I guess he's got a room at one of the hotels. If it's important to you, we can go over and check it out together." "Let's go." Kane began to rise. Abel reached out and hauled him back into his seat. "After you get some food in you, Kane. Not before." Kane could feel Drake's demand that they go now, and Kane struggled to regain control of his own limbs. And finally, the sheer exhaustion of his body overcame Drake's command, and he slumped back into his chair. "Okay." "How did you get hooked up with this Drake fella, anyways?" Kane shrugged again and said, "I hauled some boxes up to the house for him. He must have liked the job I did, and so he hired me to watch the carpenters. You know, make sure they weren't loafing." He struggled against the force in his own mind to not tell Abel about Drake, to not warn him to get out of town. "Well, it must be working out for you," Abel replied between bites. Abel simply sat back in his chair and watched him. Kane could tell Abel was sizing him up, trying to suss out what was really going on. But he said nothing, and so the two sat quietly until their steaks arrived from the kitchen. Kane attacked what was on his plate without saying a word. There was a hunger building in him, a hunger that could not be sated, a hunger for meat, for blood, for life. Worst of all, that hunger was pushing Kane's mind into areas he didn't like none too much. He fought back that part. There were some lines Kane Mortar wouldn't cross, and what Drake was demanding of him was one of them, not his own brother. Jubal Blevins was nearly in a panic as he searched the night for his wife. Both Kelsey and Daniel at his side, each of them armed with crosses, a sharp stick, and their wits. He was not going to risk letting the boys out of his sight until dawn, if he could help it, and he would not take that chance. At first, the boys didn't like the arrangement, but as the night wore on, he saw understanding dawn first in Kelsey's eyes, and then in Dan's. He watched in horror as the understanding turned to a white-hot rage in their gaze. As they searched the shadows near the Morgan Hotel, Jubal could feel another force winging its way through the town. It was a force he had not felt since that night, long ago in the wilds of the Transylvanian mountains. It was clear that Mariah was not the only one missing. Gwendolyn Morgan also could not be found, nor could Miss Amanda and several others. Sheriff Taylor had gone inside to the Morgan Hotel to roust a few men he could trust to keep the search quiet. He knew that Taylor didn't want to panic the town, and he definitely didn't want a bunch of half-drunk loggers and miners tearing the town to pieces. Jubal wasn't sure how wise that course of action was, but he had more information than the sheriff, and understood that Jed Taylor would not believe him if he started talking about vampires and such. "Mr. Blevins," Dan called out. "Isn't this the gun you gave Mrs. Blevins?" He picked up the revolver and handed it to Jubal. Jubal's heart nearly broke at the sight of the hammerless banker's special. There was no way that Mariah would be careless enough to drop it. Looking closely at it, he realized that it had not been fired. He looked around the alley and told the boys, "Spread out, search every corner." And he was amazed as the boys were able to see fearlessly into the darkest corners of the alleyways. They moved with their jaws set in determination and worry as they searched the area as if it were broad daylight. "What is that?" Daniel called out as he dashed into one of the deepest shadows. A moment later, he returned to the light of Jubal's lantern and with 2 small books. "What have you got there?" Jubal asked. The boy handed him the books. His heart dropped into his stomach when he saw that the first book was his wife's Eastern Star monitor. The second seemed to be a polyglot of the same sort. He gently opened the front page and read the name, Vlad Dracula. His blood ran cold with the realization that the very vampire who threatened his town was the one from whom he, Guy, and Arthur had stolen their 3 children so many years ago. "Count Dracula," he said to himself. "Here from faraway Transylvania." Still in his mind and emotions, he looked at the boys. He realized that he now had to do the one thing he dared not. He frowned and said, "I need you boys to do something for me while I continue to search for Mariah." "Anything," Daniel said. And something deep inside him told Jubal that the boy truly meant what he had said. "Take these books to Arthur Seward and tell him that I believe that the Count has Mariah. I'm going to continue to look for her, but I need you two to stay with Arthur and with Temple. You must not let what I fear has happened to my wife happen to Temple or yourselves." "But we can help find her, help get her back," Kelsey protested. "Yes, but I believe that the ultimate target of our adversary is not my dear sweet Mariah, but Temple and yourselves." "Why?" Kelsey demanded. "I don't have time to explain. Just please take the books and go. Arthur will understand and know what to do. And whatever he tells you to do, do it. If not for my sake, if not for the sake of Mariah, or for yourselves, then for Temple's sake. Follow the instructions of no man other than Arthur, and any that he might appoint to guide you. Protect Temple, and protect yourselves. Dracula will come for you next." Jubal knew that he was hitting them below the belt. He understood their feelings for the girl, and he suspected each other, and knew that it would drive them to protect her at all costs, and might just let all 3 of them survive this ordeal. Both boys, caught up in the excitement of the night, of the hunt, and of the serious duty he had just laid on their souls, nodded their heads in unison. "We'll be back, Mr. Seward, as soon as we can," Kelsey told him, taking the books and putting them in his pocket. Just do whatever Arthur tells you to do. I'll keep searching for Mariah. Well, the boys turned and tore off down the street, and some small part of his mind wondered if he would ever see them again. This was a serious situation, and he needed to be able to act free of concerns for their safety. He kept telling himself that sending them to Arthur was for their own protection. As they disappeared into the night, Jubal turned back to his search, his heart heavy as he came to the conclusion that he would likely find his wife neither alive nor dead, and would be forced to do the unthinkable. As he was about to enter another dark alley from which he'd heard some low groan, lit only by a small circle of light from his lantern, he heard a voice from behind him say, in a soft southern drawl, "I wouldn't go in there by myself. Where are you?" And turning, he saw Marshal McKnight standing behind him and with a saber in his hand. Now, I wonder exactly why a banker in the American West would know a Transylvanian count. And Jubal frowned and said, "You have some idea of who is responsible for the deaths?" "I have an idea of what is responsible, but not who." Jubal sighed and said, "'Tis a long story, but 15 or so years ago, several members of a band of adventurers invaded a Transylvanian vampire's castle and stole away with 3 children that were meant as sacrifices to some dark power that would give him dominion over all Witchkin. We were, part of an organization called the Society Lucette Via, the Shining Road. Of 7 men who entered that castle, only 3 of us escaped, and I fear that poor guy Plant has already fallen to the count." "He has fallen and been freed?" Jubal nodded, not really surprised by the revelation. "You're doing?" "He was partially responsible for the family I found on the side of the trail. Now I'm after his master." "The Count is no ordinary vampire, if such a thing could be said to exist. He wields vast powers of darkness. He can command the winds, the creatures of the night, and even mortals. He has prodigious strength, and ordinary weapons will not harm him. Or anything could die if its head is removed from it. Die, yes, but Dracula, he's already dead. Simply killing him will not keep him in his grave." "There are ways," the Marshal insisted, and Jubal nodded and said, "The 3 children are Dan, Kelsey, and Temple." The Marshal returned the nod and replied, "I have not met the young lady, but from what I can see of the boys, they have remarkable strength in witcheries." "You're no ordinary lawman or even Witchkin, are you?" "The blood of 3 noble and powerful Witchkin families flows in my veins. My sister is beyond my ability to save, and my father has walked a dark path as a penance imposed by his fevered mind. So no, I'm not an ordinary Witchkin, again, if there is such a thing. I came here to hunt down the creature responsible for the deaths I've seen, and to keep it from spreading beyond the city's limits, even if I must burn it to the ground." Jubal nodded. "And if we don't stop it by sundown tomorrow, I fear it may be too late. The numbers increase exponentially." "And you believe the 3 children are this Count's true target? Why?" And Jubal sighed. "We don't have much time to discuss these things. I must find my wife. Take a moment. It may save the children's lives. We believe they are the last of the breed of Witchkin. We have no name for them as a race, only to what kind of Congress they conform to protect themselves and to keep the dark Witchkin from spreading. It is called a corpus tray, a body of 3, and when 3 of them come together in a particular Congress, their already impressive witcheries become far more than the sum of their parts." "You play a dangerous game, you and this Society of the Shining Path. Few mortals can stand against such a Witchkin." "I know. What started out as a group who wished to study the Witchkin, we became one that fought them. But our fight was originally against our Witchkin. It was the goal of my group to help the whole organization see that we don't have to have war with all of the Witchkin. We sought to bring some onto the road, hence our theft of the children that who were about to be sacrificed to the Count's power, wished to raise them to see themselves as part of humanity, not to war against it, to stand for what is right under God's canopy. A noble proposition, but I'm afraid you must have angered the wrong Witchkin. Now I have to put it to right. It was at that statement that Jabal understood that he and his group had set out to accomplish what was already done. In the distance, he could see Sheriff Taylor approaching them. I must necessarily send away what I meant to protect. Will you help me find my wife? Will you help me stop the evil that is descending onto the town of Lunam this night? McKnight snorted. I'm here, ain't I? So you are. Well, do you have any idea where this Count might be making his base of operations? And Jabal nodded and pointed to the western ridge that surrounded the valley. Up there, the old Shipton house. Reverend Holloway stood nervously on the platform with his wife, found himself staring out into the darkness beyond the station's light, wondering what was happening to the town. He could almost feel the pall of evil as it fell on the city of Lunam. Some part of his mind told him that he should be staying to help the townsfolk deal with it, but another part was glad to be leaving. He was genuinely worried about how Temple Seward was going to deal with the information that he had tried to drive Daniel Plant from her and Kelsey. He still thought that Arthur Seward was playing with fire, with allowing his firm friendship between her and Daniel to develop. But as he pointed out, she was his daughter, and not the parson's. You seem nervous, Joseph. What's wrong? His wife Emily asked from his side. Emily had always been a great blessing to Joseph. They had been together for nearly 30 years, and although she had never borne him a living child, the two still found solace in their lives and service to God. She was a short, plump woman with a round face and rosy cheeks. Her mouth was a small bow of a perpetual smile that was wedged between those cheeks. Her grey eyes that matched the bond of hair she always wore perpetually carried a hint of amusement, even when she was sad. And he was convinced that she was truly a blessing God had put on this earth to remind him to find his own joy in life, and he loved her dearly. I just feel strangely tonight, Emily. Can't really put my finger on it, but I think we need this trip. It's an opportunity to rejuvenate ourselves before returning home to do more of the Lord's work. And while we're gone? Wyman Dickerson will be conducting services. He's a respectable man, something of a scholar, and is above reproach. It just seems awful sudden, Joseph. I know, but funds came available suddenly, and it is for a limited time. He lied. He felt bad about the lie, but also didn't want to worry his wife about the situation. It was best just to take Arthur Seward's advice and lie low for a while. A trip to San Francisco should be enjoyable for him and his wife. I guess it's a blessing from God, then, Emily told him, but he was unsure if she believed that or not. And suddenly a chill fell over the station, and Joseph Holloway pulled his coat tight around him, but to no avail. It was a chill of the soul, not of the flesh. For a moment, he thought he saw a flash of movement in the shadows, but then it was gone. Emily gasped suddenly next to him, and when he turned to look, he saw two dirty-faced men, miners from the cut of their clothing, were dragging his wife away. "Stop that!" he yelled as he turned to free his wife, and suddenly the lights hanging around the platform burst, and with the sound of shattering glass, the night went dark. A shadow rose up from the floor in front of him, and in the dim light of the stars, he could make out only a nearly phosphorescent face that seemed to float on the darkness. The eyes were like red embers against a sickly pale green complexion, and they burned into him.
"Parson Holloway,"
the face spoke to him.
"Worry not for your wife. You two shall be reunited very soon. You are the spiritual leader of this community, and so it is you with whom I first contend.
The accent was strangely European. Contend?
We are at war, parson, you and I. You may not realize it, but I do. And with my converting you to my cause, the rest of this town shall fall. Let me introduce myself. I am Voivode Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, and I have come to recover what was stolen from me.
I don't understand, Holloway said as his eyes tried to wander from the face. He knew he should be concerned about something, but the voice seemed to keep him from remembering what it was. There was a brief sound of a struggle, and then a low murmur of protest that was followed with a soft sounds not unlike a calf nursing. Joe could not look away from the eyes in front of him.
You will very soon. That is what is sad. You never knew you were in war, and therefore never stood a chance.
The face suddenly grew as it lunged at him. For just a moment, his mind registered that he was under attack. He managed a single scream of, "No!" Then powerful hands grabbed him by the shoulders and lifted him from the ground, leaving his legs flailing in the air like a man hanged as he was pulled forward towards the face. A black-clad arm reached across his face, and a hand as cold as ice pushed his head aside. And there was a brief pinprick of pain, and then Joe Holloway realized that there was far worse things than being shot by Temple Seward. As he and Kelsey headed south out of town towards the Seward property, Daniel found himself not having to hold back the pace of the chase nearly as much as he usually did with Kelsey. It seemed like the other young man had suddenly grown wings and was very nearly flying along beside him, nearly all of their lives flare between them. "I have a bad feeling about this, Daniel," Kelsey's voice echoed in the halls of his mind. "I can feel something is wrong. I just can't put my finger on it." He thought back at his friend, trusting that Kelsey could pick the words out of his head. As they passed the train station, Daniel could have sworn he heard a single cry of, "No!" But he couldn't be sure, and at that moment, Temple's safety took almost all precedent. It was perhaps another 2 minutes later, as they left the city limits at a ground-devouring speed, that two shadows seemed to materialize out of nowhere into what looked like miners in the road ahead. There was something dead or lifeless about them, yet they still moved and did so remarkably well. Daniel glanced over to Kelsey, who nodded to him before they skidded to a stop at the two men blocking the road. And up close he could see where their eyes were, like coals burning in the darkness. Their expressions were feral, almost like a hunting wolf. "These are the two boys Drake wants. Let the others get the girl." Daniel didn't have to look at Kelsey. They both knew and understood. Mr. Blevins was right. Someone was after the three of them, and had evidently sent more men after Temple. Knowing that his friend would have his back, Daniel charged forward, and at the last instant leapt high, clearing the head of the miner by a good 2 feet. On his slow arc downwards, he felt a vice-like grip grab his ankle at a speed that was preternatural as his own. He hit the dusty Nevada road face first, and for a brief instant saw stars explode into his head, just before being grabbed by inhumanly strong arms and manhandled to his feet, his back to his attacker. The crucifix in his pocket forgotten, he remembered what Jin Chow had taught him and Kelsey about fighting. He stomped backwards and down with as much force as he could muster, and then slung his head straight back, and he was rewarded with the sound of bones breaking with both strikes, just before he grabbed an arm holding his right shoulder, pulled and pivoted his weight forward. He watched as the man who'd grabbed him sailed over his hip and onto the ground. But the man wasn't even stunned for a moment. He just picked himself up and dusted off his coat before speaking. Now, Drake said to bring them in alive, not anything about what kind of condition they had to be in. And then he grinned and Daniel watched sharp, snake-like fangs descend and lock into place where the man's canines should be. To his right, he heard Kelsey struggling with his captor, but couldn't afford to look in that direction. He knew that if his friend was in trouble, that he would feel it over their connection. And as the fangman charged at him, Daniel locked down on his left foot and tried to drive the heel of his boot into the dirt as he kicked out with his right. The blow caught the man right in the breadbasket and with enough force to fold him over and drive him back. However, there was not the sudden rush of air he had expected. It was as if the man did not breathe. He simply backed up a few feet and then charged again. The only thing in Daniel's mind was that these guys were keeping him and Kelsey from Temple. He was becoming angry, and he could feel a surge of something race through his body. As the man closed again, this time Daniel locked down his back foot and stepped into the kick, putting everything he had behind it. And as the man was bent over to charge him, that put his face and head well within Daniel's range. There was a sickening crunch from the sole of Daniel's boot plowing through the man's face and deep into his head, shattering the brain case. To his right, there was a ripping and tearing sound. He turned to see where Kelsey's eyes were glowing with an inner light, and he was surrounded by a nimbus of blue light. The other attacker was flopping on the ground, his arms and legs torn from his body and hurled to the four winds. Kelsey looked at him and nodded. One word would exchange between them as they tore down the road towards Arthur Seward's home. Behind them, unseen by any mortal eye, Daniel's attacker's face and head began to stitch itself together. Kelsey's foe was inching his way towards his severed right arm, and both men's wounds were sickeningly bloodless. The fever burning in Cain Mordor's brain kept sending him a single command. Bring him. He fought against it with all his might as he walked towards the road that led to the Shipton house. He fought to warn his brother, to somehow stop from unfolding the events he knew he would be incapable of preventing. Where are we going, Cain? His brother Abel demanded, at his side. Somebody wants to talk to you. Who, Cain? Abel demanded. Mr. Drake. Well, then Mr. Drake can get his sorry ass down here if he wants to talk to me, Abel told him. Or better yet, you and I can get out of this town ourselves. Something bad is going on here. Something I don't like none too much. It's time to head back to the logging camps. He reached out and grabbed Cain by the arm. No! Cain exploded on his brother. You have to come with me. He spun around and shoved his brother to the ground. Run, Abel, run! He wants you. He wants me to bring you to him. He growled in a voice that dripped with pain and defiance. And then Drake's will reasserted itself. We have to go to the Shipton house. Cain watched his brother pick himself up off the ground and shake his head. There ain't no cause to shove me, little brother. And suddenly, Abel spun on him and slammed his fist into the side of Cain's head before bearing him to the ground. And as the two rolled across the dusty road, locked in a fraternal conflict as old as the species itself, Cain was surprised when they ended up in the ditch. His brother rolled on top of him and then began to repeatedly pummel him. He tried to rise. He tried to push his brother off him. His hand found something hard and heavy beside him in the grass, and grabbing it, he swung his arm up into an arc that impacted his brother's temple. He watched the dim lights as Abel's eyes rolled back into his head as he fell to the side. And Cain stumbled to his feet. The fire in his brain continued to burn him, to drive him to answer the master's call. He dropped the bloody rock onto the side of the road and stumbled off to find out what had happened to Sheriff Plant, or to kill Sheriff Plant, or to do something that Drake demanded of him. The inferno in his mind was burning out all other thought. Temple Seward was agitated as she paced back and forth along the carpet of the parlour. She could feel something in the air. And there was a danger out of the night, and she knew that Daniel and Kelsey were in it, and that made her just that much more agitated. She barely noted the flames in the fireplace as they roared intently when she approached it, and then waned as she drew away. Li Zhang, one of her father's Chinese servants whom she suspected was far more than just a servant, stood quietly at the windows, looking out at the night. His countenance and face were a stark contrast to her own. He was serene and calm, but even with him she could sense a tight power coiled and ready to strike. She knew that he was there to guard her from what she had no idea, and her father had been less than forthcoming on that subject. But she could feel in her bones that her two closest friends, her closest confidants, were in a life and death struggle. All she could do about it was pace back and forth like a useless git. Crash! A dark figure came crashing through the French doors leading onto the veranda as all the lamps in the parlour fluttered out. Then, like a black sheet being lifted from the floor, an image rose to reveal a floating, phosphorescent face, and with a beak of a nose and eyes of red coals bobbing on the shadows of his clothes.
"There you are, my dear,"
the voice said in a thick accented English. In a flash, Li Xing pulled a staff from behind the curtains and lashed out with a preternatural speed. The wood of the staff whistled through the air, and with a loud whack was picked from midair by the man's hand. Xing, however, was not that easily stopped as he twisted the staff down and to the side. Crack! It snapped in half, and the monk spun in place before driving it into the shadows. The blow caught the shadow man by surprise, and he stumbled backwards, pulling the staff from Xing's hands. And with a smile, the man pulled the staff from his chest and said,
"A little to the left."
He snapped the staff in his hands as behind him the fire in a grate roared up the chimney. "Run, Miss Temple," Xing told her. "Find your father, or Jin Chao." Nodding, Temple ducked ahead and ran towards the door. Finding it locked, she looked towards the two figures who were circling each other like Roman gladiators, looking for an opening. Outside the shattered French doors, Temple could see dead white faces bobbing in the night as they approached the opening left by the shadow man. Behind them, she could see clouds close around the night sky as the wind began to pick up. Glancing towards the roaring fire, Temple frowned grimly, and then with a wave of her hand, a long gout of flames came rushing from the fireplace to separate the combatants. Xing nodded grimly and raced towards the door. In summoning a remarkable level of strength for such a small man, Xing twisted the doorknob until the mechanism inside of it broke, and the door swung open to reveal both her father and Jin Chao. And Xing quietly pushed her through the door and told her father and his friend in Chinese, "These undead do not hop." "No, they don't, my friend," her father answered. "The master is in there. Then we need to be somewhere else," Jin Chao said. "I think the house is surrounded by those things," she told her father. And taking her firmly by the shoulders, he said, "Listen to me carefully, Temple. He is after you and Kelsey and Daniel. He means to sacrifice you to some hellish denizen for power over all Witchkin. You must not let him take a single one of you, for if he does, the other two will surely attempt to rescue them, and thus all will fall into his grasp." Suddenly, thunder rolled up the valley, and bolts of lightning lit up the night sky in a succession of artillery-like strikes. "If they are inside the house, then we must abandon it," Jin Chao said. Her father nodded and said, "Of course." "The storm will cover our retreat," Jin Chao said, looking knowingly at Temple as he headed down the hall towards the front door. And as they skidded to a halt in the main foyer, the shadow-dressed man was barring their way, his visage of feral anger.
"So, you have begun to discover your own witcheries. So much the better, my dear."
I am not your dear, Temple growled at him.
Nevertheless, you will come with me.
His red eyes flared in the shadows, and suddenly she felt a power fall over her mind. Her senses seemed to suddenly go to sleep. Her feet fought her will to move on her own volition, and Temple battled that movement with all of her will. She knew that should she take that step, then she will be lost forever. She drew on deep wells of her own will and found them to be insufficient for the job. She felt her foot tremble and begin to move. Mentally, she screamed into the universe for help, and the universe answered. Suddenly, Kelsey and Daniel were in her mind, supporting her, shielding her. Her foot stopped, and bowing her head, she looked through hooded lids at the creature who would master her soul. She could feel the current build around her like a million ants crawling all over her body. Boom! A bolt of lightning slammed into the doors behind the shadowy figure, hurling him into the staircase. The force of the explosion sent pieces of wood careening across the room like shrapnel, and Temple had no idea how they managed to get away with only a few scrapes and cuts. And grabbing her hand and pulling her through the door, her father said, "Come, child, let's not waste Providence's gift." Near gale-force winds whipped up the scrubs, bushes, and trees of the western Nevada mountains, slowly stripping them of their foliage as Temple, her father, and their two companions staggered into the night. And Temple stopped for a moment and then nodded to her left. "That way." "What's there?" her father asked. "Kelsey and Daniel," she replied. Without another word, the quartet turned to follow her lead into the dark and stormy night. Screams began to echo through the night, punctuated by the occasional gunshot they evoked the chaos that was engulfing the town. Fear McKnight was quickly coming to the conclusion that Lunam was lost. The Count had deployed his troops brilliantly, building them slowly until they could swoop down in a single wildling night and take most of the town. He admired his plan, if not the man himself. He could feel Lunam dying around him. No matter how many of the undead he, Jubal Blevins, and Sheriff Taylor sent to the final death, they kept coming from the shadows. He could sense the trap into which the vampires were trying to force them. And looking around, he realized that trap would be sprung at the livery stable. Turning to the Blevins, he saw the man understood what was happening. "They're cutting us off from the town." "Well, we really don't want to go where they want us to," Sheriff Taylor said, reloading his Colt and hefting a long broken scythe blade he was using to relieve the vampires it shot between the eyes of the heads. "Any ideas?" "One or two," Fear answered. He tossed the saber he carried to Blevins and said, "Take care of it. It was my father's." "What do you plan?" the banker asked nervously. "I'm going to give them something else to worry about. When I lead them away, I want you to head to the Shipton house. I'll circle around and I'll meet you there. It is there that I suspect will ultimately come to battle this Count Dracula of yours." And with the toe of one boot, he then popped the other one off, and then repeated the process. He realized that his companions had to think him mad. And taking off his gun belt, he tossed it and his guns to the sheriff and said, "Just remember this. Cats are your friend this night. If you shoot me, you only make me angry." As the sheriff caught the gun on belt, a fear reached deep into his soul. His great-grandmother Kate was always quick to remind him that the family's gifts were not tied to the moon. This night, he would prove her right as he reached deep into his own soul to find that column of silver light that was his spirit. And plunging his mind into it, he summoned the change he first experienced on that fateful day at Bon Travail, when his life turned to bitter ashes. He felt his body grow and change as the animal side of his mind began to grow in proportion with his body. Some part of his mind noted the ripping and tearing of his clothing as he literally grew out of them. He noted a look of awe and wonder on the sheriff's and the banker's face as he pulled the last remnants of his shirt from his body before throwing his head back and screaming into the night. and then he charged in the direction of the trap the vampires were setting. With satisfaction, he noted that the vampires that had been herding him broke ranks. Some surged to follow him as fast as their feet would carry them. Others broke ranks and fled at this new development, which left them wondering if they truly were the most dangerous thing stalking the streets of Lunam this particular night. And as he tore down the road, he could feel his gut turn at their unnaturalness as they followed. He felt the sting of bullets before he heard their rapport from more than a dozen vampires awaiting him at the livery and brushing them aside. As lead was not his bane shot, he charged into the middle of the dark figures and began laying about with his claws. He broke knees and legs with vicious clawed kicks that left long, jagged, bloodless wounds. He swept heads from vampires' shoulders and tossed them downrange away from their bodies, and he smashed bodies together with inhuman strength. At one point, he was literally raking a fallen vampire's head from his body with his clawed foot as he tossed others that were trying to climb his body away from him. Soon, the undead began to fear the huge white man-cat that had exploded amongst them. They began to withdraw to the shadows and attack in waves. One group would feint in one direction, while the other tried to attack from the opposite flank. But they were still corporeal beings, so even the slightest scrape of their bodies on the dusty ground told of fear where they were. More than one vampire ended up crashing through the wall of a livery barn from a clawed kick, and then, as if by some unheard burglar, they all melted back into the shadows. As the dust slowly settled to the ground, the great cat realized that it was alone, its foes having shown a better part of valor, and only the nervous snorting of the horses could be heard around him. And throwing his head back, he screamed of his victory. Gibble Blevins watched as the huge white man-cat disappeared into the night. He could hear the vampires cut and run, either for safety or in pursuit. He knew not which. And nodding to the sheriff, he then pointed in the direction of the Shipton house. That direction. Above them, clouds had begun to engulf the night sky. The sound of the battle, coming from the direction of the livery stable, was horrendous. There were gunshots, screams of pain, and the crash of heavy objects into walls. And finally, after about half an hour, there was a final scream of victory. And Jubal wondered for a moment how many vampires had met their true death this evening. And then in a thought of near total despair, he realized that their numbers would be replaced at sunset tomorrow. They had to hurry. As he and Jed climbed the hill from which the Shipton house overlooked the town, picking their way through scrub, pine and low bushes, Jubal began to realize that they were alone. Either they had slipped completely through the Count's defenses, or they were walking into another trap. The frightening part was that he was unable to decide which idea he feared more. As they topped the long road full of wagon ruts that led to the house, he could see where there were no lights burning in the windows. It stood out against the cloud-filled sky, a great black edifice that seemed to lord itself over the town below. It exuded a cold evil that Jubal could feel in his bones. And looking over to Jed, he said, "Looks like nobody's home." "Then Mariah can't be here," Jed replied. "No," he told Jed. "She's here. I can feel it." "It looks like fires are starting down below." Jubal turned and looked down at the town. He could see where the Seward house at the base of the valley was on fire. Inside the town itself, several buildings were ablaze as the wind whipped the fires from one structure to another. They may not be able to enter a house without permission, but it doesn't mean that they can't set fire to it and take the people as they flee. This has been well planned. He looked back at the house and said, "Maybe too well." He began to walk towards the front porch, climbing the stairs one at a time, and he could feel his body begin to thrum with some eldritch energy that emanated from the structure. The crucifix in his pocket seemed to buzz in a counterbeat to it. Reaching a door, he turned and nodded to Jed before taking the handle. He found it unlocked. Jed's face registered his own surprise. They quickly slipped inside and closed the door again as quietly as they could. And it was then that Jabal noted that the windows had all been painted black from the inside. Heavy curtains completed blocking outside light, and in this case, keeping the light inside from shining outwards. The first thing they noticed in the light of the lamps that burned on the walls was that the main room had been cleared of all furniture, and the non-load bed and walls had been removed. In the middle of the room, a strange altar sat before 3 X-shaped structures that were attached to both the ceiling and floor. The structures tilted backwards at the top, and small grooves ran down the lower limbs of where small copper balls sat. He shuddered at the thought of what those grooves were meant to do. And next to him, Jed Taylor stood, wide-eyed and staring. "What the hell?" he asked softly. "An altar for a sacrifice to evil," Jabal told him. "Sacrifice what?" "Kelsey, Daniel, and Temple," Jabal answered him quietly. "Why them?" the sheriff demanded. "Because Guy, Arthur, and I stole them from him 15 years ago in faraway Transylvania. The Count means to use their lives to gain dominion over the world." "How do we stop him?" Jed asked. "We find Mariah and set fire to the place." "I'm sorry, I can't let you do that, Mr. Blevins," a sweet voice said in a French accent. And turning in the direction of the voice, he saw poor dead Desiree standing with her hands on her hips. And next to her stood Dog Meacham, holding a gun on them. And he said, "Hello, Jabal." "Jed." "I thought you left town," Jess said. "I didn't get very far," Meacham explained. "Just as well, though. Now I will grow no older." And he frowned and said, "Now, put your hands up." "And if we don't?" Jed asked in defiance. Bam! A single shot rang out and Jed collapsed to his knees, blood spreading across his chest. In a flash, Desiree flashed forward, catching the fallen sheriff before he could hit the floor. Jabal used a flurry of movement to grab the door behind him and dart outside. Unfortunately, he ran smack into a man he did not recognize. "Hold him! The master wants to deal with him personally," Meacham cried. Impossibly strong hands grabbed Jabal by the shoulders and lifted him from the ground. And kicking his feet vainly, he tried to twist out of the vampire's grip, but found himself unable to break free. And suddenly, the world flashed past him, and the back of his head slammed into the doorframe. The stars flared to life in his vision. He felt himself slip into the darkness of unconsciousness. Lightning flashed between great black, pendulous clouds in the sky above Kelsey and Daniel as they skidded to a stop in the low brush and trees that dotted the land between the Seward home and the town. Without a word exchanged between them, Kelsey nodded off to their left. The message was clear. Temple was on the move, and they had to reach her before the Count did. And nearly flying across the ground, Kelsey could feel the winds begin to pick up, and the brush and scrub pine bent nearly over under their force. And Kelsey found he had difficulty staying on course, as whenever he would take one of his assisted leaps, he would be blown off course. And Daniel, on the other hand, ducked his head, held onto his hat, and ploughed ahead like a bull in a river. His eyes pierced the darkness and the storm far easier than Kelsey's. Kelsey wasn't sure how far they'd gone, as the windstorm kept confusing his sense of direction. All he knew was that Temple was in a particular direction, and moving not nearly as fast as he and Daniel. When they topped the hill that looked down into the valley that ran parallel to the one in which the Seward home sat, looking down, they could see a line of 6 undead that were closing in on a small party, fleeing into the night. Behind them was perhaps another 6 who were staying far enough back to harry the party, but not directly threaten it. Temple was not in that party. Again, he and Daniel shared a glance and a nod. Almost as one, they surged down the hill towards the waiting ambush. In the wind and lightning, the vampires were unable to hear their approach. Daniel hit 2 of them in the back feet first as he launched himself downhill. The 3 of them went tumbling into the scrub brush in a tangle of arms and limbs. The remaining 4 turned to look at Kelsey, and then back to where Dan and their comrades were tangling. One turned to aid them as the other 3 pivoted to take on him. Boots sliding in the Rocky Mountain soil, Kelsey managed to stop about 20 feet away. He grinned and reached deep into his mind for the force that had awakened there over the last few years. Without ever touching him, he lifted one of them into the air, and then with a twist of his mind, the head of the man twisted free from the body, just before he exploded into dust. "Bill!" The closest vampire to his victim screamed in protest, while the one on his left suddenly turned around and headed back into the fray with Daniel. "He may run, but I won't, boy," the vampire growled. "The master didn't say what kind of condition other than alive he wanted you in." He suddenly disappeared into the shadows, and then, out of nowhere, iron-like claws grabbed him from behind and lifted him into the air. Kelsey pushed off the ground with his mind and rocketed up and out of that horribly cold grasp, and as he began to fall, the winds pushed him off course, and he twisted to find his foe, and what he found made his blood run cold. Instead of a man, a great bat-like creature fought to control its flight in the winds. And dropping to the gravel below, he scrambled to keep from sliding further down the hill. Looking upwards, he reached out with his mind and tore the wings from the bat thing. It screamed once and shifted back to a human form as its wings slowly became arms that were tossed on the winds. The vampire tried to control his fall, but was unable to attain any sort of balance with no arms and in a gale. Kelsey grabbed him by the head and twisted it and the body in the opposite direction as he pulled them apart. A loud snap echoed through the night as the vampire dissolved into dust, only to be scattered by the winds. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain through the link it shared with Daniel, and turning to see what was happening, he was caught by a powerful right cross, by a vampire who had left the fight. As stars exploded in his head, he fought to keep consciousness as the vampire reached out to grab him. Just before grabbing Kelsey, the vampire suddenly burst into flames that scorched his face and burnt his hair. It took him several moments to clear his head, and by the time the throbbing and the light settled down to a low soreness, Temple was there, steadying him. "Where's Daniel?" he asked groggily as his mind reached out for the link he shared with their blood. "They flew off with him," Mr. Seward said, "towards the Shipton house. Pa said that they would try to take at least one of us, knowing that we would try to rescue them." He shook his head and said, "We just thought that it would be Temple that they'd get." "Not hardly," the raven-haired beauty said as she gently probed his jaw. Her touch set off a fire in his own soul. Without his command, his mind reached out and found Daniel. "Well, we have to get him back." "Yes, we do," Mr. Seward said. "And it has to be before the morning. The Count will know we're coming." "Who is this Count Dracula?" Kelsey demanded. "Count Dracula," Mr. Seward said. "He was, or rather is, a 15th century Transylvanian nobleman who fought to keep the Turks out of his country. Now some say that he sold his soul to the devil for the power to keep them at bay. All we know is that he's a very powerful vampire, and meant to sacrifice you 3 when you were children to some dark god for power over all Witchkin." "And you, Pa, and Sheriff Plant rescued us?" Mr. Seward nodded. "We stole you out from under his nose. 7 of us went into that castle. Only 3 of us came out. When we got you out of there, we moved to here and raised you as our own children." "What now?" Jin Chow asked. "Now we get Daniel back and put this European Count down permanently," Temple said angrily. "Is it wise to send you 2 in? To his lair?" another man asked. Kelsey seemed to remember his name was Zing. or something like that. Wise or not, we won't abandon Daniel, Kelsey said with a conviction that surprised even him. Where is your father? Seward asked. We left him with Sheriff Taylor. I think that Marshal McKnight was supposed to join him. They're looking for Ma. She disappeared. He said that Dracula has her. And we found these in the alley. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the books and handed them to Mr. Seward. The man turned the 2 books over in his hands, and opening the cover of each, he frowned and said, "Well, this confirms it. We have to get Daniel back before sunrise." "Well, then let's go," Kelsey said firmly. "The longer we wait, the less time we have to act." "And the boy is right," Jin Chow said. "Dracula is too dangerous to allow to make his sacrifice. He will become unstoppable." "When this is over, Father, you and Mr. Blevins have some explaining to do," Temple told him. "If we all survive," was her father's answer. "Come on," Kelsey urged. "They've got Daniel. We have to get him back." And the adults exchanged glances as Kelsey could feel some kind of debate going on between them. When an unspoken agreement had been made, they nodded and started hiking towards the west. And Kelsey had no idea how long they'd hiked as the wind seemed to part around them, leaving them in a bubble of peace as they scoured the mountain of small plants and dead limbs. Kelsey understood why the wind was there and who had created it. Turned and smiled to Temple as they picked their way up the mountain, eventually reaching a rutted road that led to the old Shipton house, perhaps 1/10 of a mile away. Jin Chow raised his hand and indicated that they should stop, and Kelsey noticed that the man's Chinese accent had nearly disappeared when he asked, "Do we have a plan? Do we even know where the boy is?" And Kelsey closed his eyes and concentrated, looking for his connection to Daniel. With some difficulty, he found it weak, but steady, and he pointed towards the house in the distance. "In there." "There seems to be only one guard," Jin Chow said. "Either he sent his forces into town to convert it, or it's a trap. Or both," Zing added. And Kelsey turned to Temple's father and said, "We're working in the dark here, Mr. Seward. What exactly are we dealing with here? These vampires obviously drink blood and are strong. What's the best way to kill them? So far, taking their heads off has been effective, but it's draining. Also, some of them explode into ashes, and others just stop moving. Why is that?" "A wooden stake through the heart will kill them. As you said, taking off their head is effective, and so is fire. And the light of the sun can burn them. They recoil from holy objects." "So we could have used the crosses Pa gave us to drive them away?" "Yes," Mr. Seward answered, surprised. "How have you been fighting them?" He nodded to Jin Chow and Zing. "The way they taught us." The older man chuckled and shook his head. "If it works, we can't argue with it." "That still leaves us with the question of how do we get Daniel back?" "We could attack head-on with overpowering force," Kelsey said. "If we hit them fast and hard enough, we could overwhelm them. Or we could split forces. One side attacks from the front door as a distraction, while the second one enters quietly through the back and catch them between us." Jin Chow suggested. "Both plans have merit," Seward said. "I like the second one best, though. I think it has the best chance of succeeding. Pa said to listen to you and do what you told us so. That works for me," Kelsey told him. "Now, how do we divide ourselves up?" In the distance, they heard Daniel scream and felt his mind cry out in pain. "That was Dan," he said. "They're hurting him." "Then hurry," Temple urged, and Seward looked over at Zing and Jin Chow. "You two, take Temple around to the back of the house. When you hear our attack, rush in and catch them from behind." The three of them nodded and started to make their way around to the back of the house. "Best we give them time to get in position," Mr. Seward told Kelsey. "I'd feel more comfortable if Temple were somewhere else, somewhere safe." Kelsey told the older man. As would I, Kelsey. But I think, for all our plans to come to fruition, the three of you must all be here tonight. This is a crucible that will forge the three of you into something far more than the sum of its parts. Now, what do you think is the best way to take out the lone guard? Seward asked him, as if it were a school exercise. Leave that to me. The door, too, Kelsey told him. Daniel screamed several more times, and Kelsey could feel his pain as something tore through his friend's body like a lightning bolt. While waiting for Temple's message that they were in place to come over the connection they shared, he and Dr. Seward worked their way silently closer to the house. He nearly lost control when he got an image from Dan demanding that he run away. And he could feel the other boy's willingness to sacrifice himself to save Kelsey and Temple. Kelsey reached out with his mind and felt the air around the large vampire's head, being very careful not to let his psychic hands actually touch its flesh. He waited and tried to control his nerves and desire to rush in and save the other boy, to whom he felt closer than even his brother. And after what seemed like an eternity, he finally got the signal. I would have thought he crushed the vampire's head with his psychic hands, and then ripped it from his shoulders. And then charging up the stairs, he hit the front door with a psychic fist. The power he'd always kept under close guard in fear of hurting someone, he released against its wooden surface, fueled by his anger, his fear, his worry, and something else to which he dared not give a name. The fist ripped the heavy oaken structure from its frame and shattered it against the stairs on the other side. Daniel Plant awoke disorientated, cold and in pain, and very uncomfortable. Motes of light danced before his vision as he struggled to rise. He reached for his head, but his wrists were bound by something hard and cold. And shaking his head to clear his vision, he realized that he was lying halfway upside down, at about a 45-degree angle. His feet and hands were splayed out and bound by some kind of metal bands on a giant X or cross. A fifth, larger band stretched across his chest. He also realized that he was buck naked and bare-assed. "There's no use in trying to break those shackles, Daniel," Doc Meacham's voice said. "The Master has witched them to make them unbreakable." And turning his head towards the sound of the older man's voice, he saw Mr. Blevins trussed up and tied to a chair. His head lolled forward onto his chest, like he was asleep or unconscious, or worse. "Well, you won't hold it against me if I try anyway, will you?" He strained and tore at the shackles binding his wrists. It was all in vain. Daniel could twist a horseshoe in half with his bare hands, but he couldn't get the shackles to even budge. "Go right ahead. You'll just tucker yourself out and will be easier to handle when the time comes." "Time comes for what?" Daniel demanded. "You'll find out," Desiree Noir said, snapping around his head to see the woman he had seen dead on the ground just earlier this morning. He half yelled, "You're dead! Your neck was snapped!" And she smiled and approached him, her hips swaying in some rather interesting ways. "No, my neck was disjointed, but not anymore," she said in her thickly accented English. She ran her fingers along his jawline, and they were cold as ice, but still managed to kindle a fire in his loins. And with a smile, she looked up and then back down at him. "It's too bad we don't have more time together. I've always thought you were rather handsome." "Get away from me!" he growled and tried to force his body not to react to her touch. "You're not alive. You're something foul and unclean." "As you will be before dawn," she said sweetly as she turned and sashayed across the room towards Mr. Blevins. "But not poor Mr. Blevins. I am told the Master is quite vexed with him and plans on making him suffer before granting him death's release." As she shook her head and added, "But not on life. The Master knows how to deal with intruders and thieves. He has something very old and very special planned for him. He says he used it to keep the Turks from his kingdom 400 years ago. "Where is this Count Dracula?" he demanded. "Oh, he's nearby. I'm sure he can hear us talking." Doc Meacham interjected. "He's waiting for our other guests to arrive." "Other guests?" Dan demanded. "You don't think you are all he wants? No, he wants Kelsey and Miss Temple too." And Dan felt a chill race down his spine at the words of the thing that had once been Doc Meacham. With a renewed vigor, born of panic, he tore at the bonds again. The shackles refused to part, no matter how hard he struggled, but he felt the wood to which they were attached begin to warp and moan. And mustering as much force as he possibly could, he tried to fold his body in half to pull his hands to his ankles. And there was a loud creak of wood, and the ceiling where the boards were attached shuddered as dust rained down on him.
"I think that perhaps there has been enough of that, young Master Blunt,"
a new voice said, just before fire and force tore through Daniel like a lightning strike. He felt every muscle in his body contract simultaneously, and for a moment he thought they were about to tear themselves from their anchors on his bones. His hair stood on end, and the scream they elicited from him echoed around the room. And finally, the force and the fire went away, and he felt his body relax. "What was that?"
"That was a device invented by an English scientist of my acquaintance. Unfortunately, he was killed by a Witchkin on whom he used it. He sent me a diagram with explanations of how it worked before he died,"
the voice said. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded.
"I am Vlad Dracula."
A man wearing all black stepped into his view. Looking upwards at the man, it was difficult to make out his features too clearly. His face was sharp, and his nose was hawk-like, with a prodigious bushy set of brows that very nearly met above his nose. From his position, Daniel had no way of accurately judging his height.
"And you and your companions will be my guests this evening."
Shaking his head, Daniel reached across the connection he shared with Kelsey and Temple. Mentally, he screamed to them, "Stay away! Run! Leave me!" He had no idea whether or not they heard him. The connection seemed to be muted somehow. And suddenly, the door to his right exploded inwards and smashed through the stairs that led to the second story of the old house. Everyone in the room, except him and Mr. Blevins, dove for cover. Even the Count seemed surprised by the force of the impact. And Daniel, being secured to the giant axe, felt his body peppered with sharp splinters of wood, but they didn't quite penetrate his skin. A burst of motion to his left caught his attention. Looking over, he saw a long sliver of wood embed itself into Doc Meacham's back, just before he exploded into ashes. Then Kelsey and Mr. Seward came charging through the door. A huge tub suspended above it tipped over, dousing them in cold water, just as they stepped onto the metal grating on the floor that was attached to a long copper cable. For long moments, they danced on its surface, as the same fire and force he had felt earlier tore its way through their bodies. Then time seemed to slow down as they both toppled forward, smoke rising from their clothing as an acrid odor, not unlike that left by a lightning strike, filled the air. There was a scuffle to his left, and he turned in time to see Zing and Jin Chao came charging through the door that led to the old house's kitchen. Temple was hot on their heels, and she screamed, "Kelsey!" And suddenly, a wind began to rip through the house, raising the pressure inside it until he could hear its very bones creaking, and his ears popped as more vampires poured down from both the stairs and from behind his would-be rescuers. And as a surge of power ran through his muscles, Dan struggled mightily, and his bonds began to feel the shackles begin to warp and tear. Then Miss Desiree rose up behind Temple with a piece of broken door. Dan screamed a warning to her, but it was lost in the howl of wind. He never heard the sound of the blow as Desiree caught the raven-haired beauty behind the ear with her makeshift club. And Dan nearly cried as he watched her crumple forwards onto the floor. And then the fire and force from the batteries hit him again. Just before he blacked out from the surge, one of his coherent thoughts was that he had doomed his friends. Dan had no idea how long he'd been out. It wasn't long enough for the sun to rise, but it was long enough for Kelsey and Temple to be stripped and secured to the other two crosses, and Mr. Seward and Jin Chow to be tied the same as Mr. Blevins, who'd since regained his senses. Zing lay on the floor, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and obviously dead. Dracula had gathered his forces around him in a now crowded room, and with some satisfaction, Dan was glad to see that somewhere in the fight between the two Chinese monks and the vampire forces that followed his losing consciousness, Miss Desiree had been dispatched with the very club of wood that she had used on Temple. She lay quite dead on the floor, pointed end of the club sticking out of her back. With meticulous care, Dracula was making preparations with various tools of occult lore. What worried Dan was the large black obsidian blade that lay on the altar. In front of the altar was an obscene idol of the same black glass as the knife. It was of some hell creature, with great bat-like wings, a bulbous head, and with the tentacles for a mouth that squatted in place, its huge malleus grasped in one hand, and a bowl in the other. Noting that Dan had regained consciousness, the Count nodded towards one of the surviving vampires that stood next to him.
If you try to escape your bonds again, you will be dealt with harshly. I would say that I am sorry for the fact that your lifeblood must be spilt for my purposes. But I am honestly not. However, I will say that I hold no animosity toward you or your triad. Only that my rise to power over all Witchkin necessitates your demise.
He then turned towards the chairs where Mr. Seward, Jin Chow, and Mr. Blevins were tied.
Your thieves, however, are of a different story. I despise thieves, and will deal with them in a manner I dealt with the Turks. After they see what has to be done, I will take much satisfaction in the soul-crushing despair your deaths will bring to them. Afterwards, it will be a stake for them, even the monk, and it will take them days to die.
There is still another piece on the board, Count, Mr. Blevins said. The unknown piece that took my knight. He shook his head and said,
It matters not. I have taken almost every other piece on the board, and retain my own rooks and pawns. Sunset tomorrow, my bishop will rise, as will my own knights.
We shall see, Mr. Blevins said. Then, turning towards Dan, the banker told him, Cats are your friends this night. And Dan sent a tendril of consciousness out along the connection he shared with Kelsey and Tempest. He tried to not look at the latter, as she was fully exposed in all her naked glory to everyone in the room. That started his heart to racing. Temple. He tried to send his own life force down the link. Temple. He nearly spoke the name. He could feel the stirrings of her consciousness as he repeated the process with Kelsey. It was taking too long. The Count was already arranging the altar. He could tell that the time of the ceremony was drawing near. And then he heard something outside on the roof. It was as soft as a cat's footfall, but it was there. Something was moving along the wooden shingles of the roof. The least you could do is explain what all of this is about before you kill us, he told the Count. The man smiled, showing his sharp canines, and said,
Your sacrifice will grant me dominion over all Witchkin. That is all you need to know, and I will not allow you to stall The time for the right draws near. I can feel the eldritch forces gathering about us.
He then picked up the knife and looked closely at its edge.
I think I will begin with you, young Daniel. You, I think, are the most likely to be difficult.
Desperately, Dan began to struggle against his bonds. He drew heavily on a connection between himself, Temple, and Kelsey, drawing his strength from their proximity. The huge vampire next to him slammed his fist into his face, and Dan's vision exploded with stars. The pain nearly caused him to black out as he yanked with everything he had with his right arm. Crack! The bolts holding the shackles to the wood of the giant X came free, and in a lightning-fast arc, he drove his fist around and caught the vampire in the side of the head and sent him rolling back over the altar, toppling it to the floor and scattering the instruments of sacrifice. Crash! 8 feet of screaming white fury blew out from the painted window above the door, streaked through the air and slammed into Dracula, clawed feet first. The sound of the scream sent shivers down Dan's spine. Reaching across his body, Dan grabbed the shackle on his left wrist and ripped it from its moorings as the man-cat and Dracula rolled across the floor. The two forms tumbled through the opening where Temple, Jin Chao, and Zing had entered earlier, locked in a deadly battle of fang and claw. Dan drew himself upwards, popped the shackles off his ankles, and then rolled off the giant X as more vampires poured into the room. The sudden eruption of violence had caught the vampires unawares. The fact that Jin Chao suddenly surged out of his chair, his bonds no longer holding him, only added to the confusion. He swung the cane-back chair in a deadly arc that drove back the vampires who were surging forward. Bam! Crack! The chair splintered against the side of the structure Dan had just cleared. Release Miss Temple and Kelsey. I will hold them at bay. Whap! The sound of a mighty blow in the other room was followed by the impact of a body against the wall, with enough force to cause the whole house to shudder. Dan picked up the large cross to which he had been secured to, ripping it from its moorings in both the wall and the ceiling. And with a great heave, he sent it flying over Jin Chao's head to crash into the crowd of vampires, who then scrambled to get out of its way. Then he turned his attention to his other 2 companions. And by the time they were free, Jin Chao had freed Mr. Blevins, who was working on untying a very groggy Mr. Seward. The huge cat in the other room screamed again, and there was another crash that nearly knocked the house off its foundation. Even the vampires battling Jin Chao stumbled as the whole building swayed to one side. One, however, didn't. The vampire who'd hit him in the face fainted in Jin Chao's direction before changing his course and making a beeline for Mr. Blevins. His huge, meaty fist ploughed into the back of the older man's head, and blood, hair, skin and brains splashed across the room as the vampire's fist killed the banker with a single blow. "Pa!" Kelsey screamed next to him. And suddenly the energy shared between the 3 young people surged through Dan's body as well, as the wall of the force rocketed away from Kelsey. It slammed the vampires into the front wall of the room, and then threw it, sweeping them into the raging windstorm outside. The whole front wall came clear of its moorings, and between them a nimbus of light surrounded Temple. Lightning danced in the yard, blowing huge holes in the grey Nevada soil, and sending the vampires scurrying to escape the fire from the sky. Another crash rocked the old house that was now dangerously swaying back and forth in the gale-force winds. "Time to get out of here!" Dan yelled over the wind and noise. "But the vampires, they're out there," Temple protested. "And up there is going to be down here before long," Dan told her, first pointing to the buckling ceiling and then the floor, before grabbing her by the hand. "But," she protested, looking down at her naked form. "You're not the only one," Daniel said. "Better to be alive and naked than dead and covered up." "Pa!" Kelsey said again as he scrambled to the fallen form of his father. "Kelsey!" Temple screamed. "We have to go!" "I can't leave him here," Kelsey protested. Dan strode across the room, shaking his head. "We have to go. We can come and get him later, during the daylight." He reached down and pulled the red head to his feet. "We have to go!" And there was a low shudder that ran through the building, just before the ceiling began to fall. Grabbing Kelsey by the waist in one hand and Temple in the other, Dan crouched and leapt out into the night. And with a thundering roar, the top floor of the old house caved into the first, collapsing the ceiling onto where they stood just a moment before. A mighty blast of air whooshed out of the first floor, peppering them with the pieces of metal, wood and glass. Looking around, Dan saw that the vampires had faded back into the darkness, obviously fearing what had transpired inside the old house. "Look," Kelsey said, as a white mist rose from the rubble, and then transformed itself into a great black wolf. It stopped for a moment and fixed its hot red eyes on the trio. But a rumble of movement from the rubble of the house caught its attention, as if deciding that, in this particular case, discretion was better part of valor. It turned on its haunches and fled over the backside of the hill. With that single action, what few vampires were left turned and fled towards the burning town at the foot of the other side of the hill. And suddenly, the pile of wooden walls groaned and shifted. A mop of champagne-coloured hair slowly emerged from the rubble. And looking around, Marshal McKnight spied the 5 of them standing there, 3 of them naked as the day they were born. And shaking his head, he casually pushed several £100 of wood and timber out of his way to free himself. What is it with the dark of the Witchkin, and the need to strip people naked? As he extricated himself from a pile of wood that had begun to smoke, Daniel noted that what was left of the Marshal's clothing was insufficient for the job of hiding his own nakedness. "And your excuse is what?" Daniel asked. The Marshal shrugged and said, "Gaining nearly half a ton of mass when I change. I've grown used to it. Perhaps one of the gentlemen could, however, loan a young lady their coat." Mr. Seward quickly removed his own coat and gave it to his daughter, blushing at having not thought of it. Looking down on the village, he finally asked, "How do we stop their spread now? They'll slowly expand from the town and eventually engulf the whole nation." "I have a way," the Marshal said, "but it will require the assistance of your 3 companions." "How?" Mr. Seward asked. "It's a spell my grandmother's taught me so, that I would never be forced to deal with that terrible choice my father faced with my sister. But we have to hurry. It all has to be completed before sundown tomorrow." As the sun sank behind the hill to the west on which the now burnt husk of the Shipton house sat, Fear McKnight looked at the solid piece of granite that Miss Temple had raised from the earth itself. It stood over 8 feet tall and was about 40 feet thick, and there were 7 more just like it at the cardinal and secondary points of the compass surrounding what was left of the town of Lunam, Nevada. Raising all 8 had forced the poor girl to tap deep, not only into her own energy reserves, but those of her 2 companions as well. Looking at it with his other sight, he was able to see the eldritch energy that it held deep in its heart. It was linked to its brothers, and the area between them was instant destruction to any undead who passed through it. After retrieving some clothing, the 5 defenders had spent the remaining hours of last night dodging vampires and trying to get as many people who were not infected out of town. They didn't bother with trying to put out any of the fires or hunt down any of the vampires. The Count had managed to escape, but not until after a fear had grievously wounded him. He suspected that he was heading back to Europe. Maybe sometime in the future, Ophir might give himself leave to travel to Transylvania and try to end the Count's existence once and for all. "What are your plans now?" he asked Arthur Seward. The older man sighed and said, "We need to re-establish our finances, which shouldn't be difficult. I'm considering a professorship at d'Iberville University in New Orleans, where there is a society presence." He looked back at his 3 charges who were talking quietly among themselves. "I think that perhaps they should enroll there as well. Or even Temple. Fear asked in surprise. Especially Temple. You told me more in one day about what those three are than 15 years of research has produced. Only because my father was researching to find out about his mother's tribe of Witchkin. He found out more on the corpus trade than what tribe she belonged to. He nodded to the three of them and said, they can make a huge difference in the war to stand between the forces of darkness and the common man. But don't expect them to form the kinds of bonds that mortals forge. Their relationship will be unconventional at best. You must become more cosmopolitan in your thinking. You surprise me, Marshal. I never expected to meet a Witchkin like yourself. And Fear simply smiled and said, when you get to D'Iberville, look up a professor named Theodore McNaughton. I think you'll find he has much in common with you. Where are you going now? I'm back to Fort Smith to see Judge Parker, and if he has anything else for me to do. The West is shrinking, but I hear tell that there might be some things he may want me to look into up and around northeastern Utah. Be safe, Marshal. The man offered his hand. Not sorry. You as well, Mr. Seward. Something tells me that the count may not yet be finished with your family. Take care of them. He shook the other man's hand gladly. I think that New Orleans may be well guarded with men like yourself there. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. What an absolutely enthralling storyline, and just perfect for a Christmas special. A big thank you to the amazing author for his dedication and patience in getting this onto the channel. Once again ticks all the boxes of what we've come to love and expect from this incredible character and universe. Merry Christmas, brother. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to get in touch with me, then please do at the contact email, which is as on screen. contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope you're all having a fantastic, warm and merry Christmas with friends and family, and eating far too much food and drinking twice as much drink as usual, and most of all, making the best of times. But above all, guys, thank you all for an incredible year of likes, shares and comments, and here's to many more in the future. Merry Christmas one and all, and above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.